The road was empty for miles, just cracked asphalt under a dull gray sky and the shadow of the Rockies looming far to the west. Tom was at the wheel, white-knuckling the steering as if pressing harder might fix the sputtering engine. "She'll make it," he muttered under his breath. I sat in the back, legs cramped, my eyes glued to the fading GPS signal. For the last 20 minutes, the line had been leading us in circles, deep into nowhere. Sarah was the first to see it, Silent Creek. At least, that's what the half-rotted sign read. The letters were barely legible through layers of grime and peeling paint. Below it, someone had scratched a word with what looked like rust or something far worse. "Go back." No one spoke as Tom eased the car down the main road. Houses lined both sides, skeletons of what they once were, wood warped from decades of neglect. Windows were either shattered or covered in dust so thick they looked opaque. The place was a ghost of a memory, the kind of town you only find in the dark corners of forgotten maps. The car shuddered and died in front of an old gas station. We climbed out, and the cold struck me like a slap. Silent Creek had an emptiness I couldn't explain. Even the wind felt wrong. It didn't whistle through the abandoned buildings. It whispered, low and deliberate, as if testing the weight of each word. Emma kicked a can near her foot, the metallic clatter echoing too loudly. "No signal," she grumbled, holding her phone high like that might summon a miracle. Jack and Tom were already walking toward the gas station. Maybe someone left a radio or a phone. I followed, my shoes scraping against loose gravel. The station was worse up close. The front windows had caved in, their jagged edges pointing outward as if something had escaped rather than entered. A sickly sweet smell hit me first. It was faint, but it clawed at the back of my throat. Inside, the shelves had long been looted, cans and bottles sprawled across the floor like dead soldiers. Sunlight trickled through holes in the ceiling, casting sharp beams onto what remained of the counter. A rusted cash register sat there, its keys stuck down with age. Behind it, a faded map hung from the wall, torn and discolored. "Guys." Tom's voice was strangled. He was staring at the floor. At first, I didn't see it, but then the light shifted, and there it was, a trail of footprints. Not dust-covered, but fresh, as if someone had walked through the place just minutes before us. They led deeper into the station, disappearing into a doorway marked staff only. A weight settled in my chest, cold and heavy. I opened my mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Jack, ever the fearless one, stepped forward and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, screaming in protest. The room beyond was dark, but not the kind of darkness you can fix with light. It felt alive, thick and inky, swallowing the air. Jack shined his flashlight into the void, and for a second, I thought I saw something move, a shape slinking back just beyond the beam. "We should go," Emma whispered. Her words hung in the still air, met only with silence. Jack's flashlight stuttered and died. "What the—" He smacked it against his palm, but the light refused to return. Something creaked, a slow, deliberate groan of wood bending under pressure. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The others heard it too. I saw their eyes dart to the far corner of the room. A figure stood there, barely visible in the shadows. It was still, too still, but I knew it was watching us. Every hair on my body stood on end. And then it moved. Not like a person. People don't slide across the floor without sound, without weight. It was closer before I realized it. Too close, its outline sharp and unnatural. My legs locked in place as it leaned forward, the faint outline of a face visible now, mouth open, jaw unhinged like a broken doll. Sarah screamed, and the sound jolted me awake. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her back into the gas station's main room. Jack and Tom stumbled out after us, slamming the door shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. "Get to the car." Tom shouted, but we all knew it wouldn't start. Whatever lived here, whatever thing was hiding in this rotting town, wasn't going to let us leave. As we bolted through the front door, I glanced back once, just once. Figure was at the window now, its face pressed against the glass, watching. It didn't follow us. It didn't need to. Somehow, I knew it was already ahead of us, waiting. We ran. My shoes slammed against the cracked asphalt, each step like a drumbeat against the silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't dare look back again, not after what I'd seen through that window. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out Sarah's frantic breaths beside me and the gravel crunching under Tom's boots. Silent Creek felt endless, every street identical. Rows of decaying houses that seemed to lean closer, as if whispering secrets to each other. The car sat ahead, lifeless and sun-bleached, exactly where we left it. I dove for the passenger door, yanking the handle so hard it almost snapped off. Tom scrambled into the driver's seat, twisting the keys. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then let out a long, wheezing death rattle. No, come on, Tom shouted, slamming the wheel with the heel of his hand. His knuckles were bone white. From somewhere behind us, a sound broke through the silence. A scraping, deliberate noise, like nails dragging over metal. I froze. It was closer than I expected. Too close. Forget the car. Jack's voice cut through the haze in my mind. We'll find somewhere to hide. We scattered, sprinting into the open street, but every building we passed felt worse than the last. My throat burned from breathing too hard, the air heavy and bitter. I could hear Sarah whispering prayers under her breath behind me, but it wasn't enough to drown out the footsteps. The footsteps, they didn't rush, didn't falter. They followed, slow and patient, as if toying with us. Jack stopped abruptly ahead, pointing toward the church, the one we'd passed earlier, its steeple leaning crooked like it might collapse at any second. There, come on. The church doors were barely hanging on their hinges, and we barreled through them with enough force to send wood splintering to the floor. Inside, the temperature dropped like a stone. My breath puffed out in thin clouds, and the smell hit me again, thick like mildew and something worse. Decay. Death. It clung to the back of my throat. We collapsed against the walls, gasping for breath. Tom sank down next to me, his hands trembling, though he tried to hide it. "What was that?" Emma whispered. Her voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the church. She was staring toward the doors, waiting, as if that thing might burst through at any second. "It's still out there," I said, more to myself than to anyone else. "It's waiting." Sarah sat apart from us, cradling her knees to her chest. "It's not supposed to be real," she said quietly. "Places like this don't exist. They don't." But they did. Silent Creek wasn't just some forgotten town. Something had happened here, something terrible, and whatever it was had never really left. The thought of those fresh footprints in the gas station returned to me, cold and sharp. Someone, or something, was still here. Jack moved toward the pulpit, his flashlight sweeping over rows of pews coated in dust. "We need to find a way out of this town," he said, "or at least figure out what the hell we're dealing with." His light caught something near the back wall. At first, it just looked like a sheet of fabric, draped carelessly over a large object. Then the beam hit the edges of a shape beneath it, tall and human-like. Jack hesitated, then moved closer, his boots echoing against the floorboards. The rest of us just watched, frozen. He reached out and pulled the cloth away. It was a statue. At least, I thought it was a statue. A figure carved of stone, its surface cracked and chipped with age. It was tall, hunched over, its hands covering its face as if shielding itself. But the longer I stared, the less it looked like stone. The texture, uneven, mottled, reminded me of something far more organic. "That's not a statue," Tom said softly, as if saying it any louder would bring it to life. And he was right. The details were too precise. The curve of the knuckles, the way the skin seemed to wrinkle and fold under its own weight. Whoever, or whatever, this had been, it hadn't been carved. It had been preserved. I stepped back. My heel hit something solid and I nearly screamed. Spinning around, I saw another figure. This one smaller, curled into a fetal position near the front pew. Its face was turned toward me, mouth frozen open in a soundless cry. We weren't alone here. This place, this church, was full of them. Jack's flashlight flickered, sputtered, and then went out completely. Darkness dropped over us like a curtain. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then came the whispering. It started soft, so quiet I thought I imagined it. But it grew louder, a chorus of voices layered over each other, chanting something I couldn't understand. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. From the darkness, a noise broke through the whispers. An awful, guttural crack, like something shifting after lying still for too long. "Run," Jack shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled blindly toward the doors, my hands outstretched, searching for something solid. Behind me, I heard the sharp scrape of stone against wood and a sound I will never forget, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. The doors were still ajar, light spilling in from the stormy sky outside. I tore through them, gasping as the cold air hit me. Jack, Sarah, and Tom were right behind me, their faces pale, eyes wide. From inside the church came the sound of splintering wood, the doors groaning louder than before. I turned just in time to see something, a shape barely visible through the dust and shadow, crawling toward us. Not walking, crawling. The whispers followed us outside, still audible even as we fled into the empty streets. The town seemed different now. The buildings leaned closer, their jagged windows staring like empty eyes. The road ahead twisted in ways that didn't make sense, and no matter how far we ran, the church's crooked steeple loomed behind us as if we'd never left. Silent Creek wouldn't let us go. It was waking up, and it was hungry. We didn't stop running until the church was a distant silhouette behind us, the crooked steeple barely visible through the shifting mist. The town stretched out before us, endless and unchanging, like we were trapped in a loop of rotting wood and crumbling stone. My chest burned with every breath. My heart beat a frantic drumroll, pounding in my ears. I wiped my sweat-slicked face with shaking hands, my mind replaying what I'd seen, those figures in the dark, crawling toward us. I didn't dare say it out loud, but I knew what they were. They weren't statues. They were people, left to decay into something unnatural. Jack slowed to a halt, bent over with his hands on his knees. We need to stop," he gasped. "We can't keep running forever." Tom leaned against a rusted lamppost, his face pale and blotchy. "Did you see that? What were they?" His voice broke on the last word. I didn't know how to answer. None of us did. Sarah stood a few feet away, hugging herself, staring into the fog that seemed to press closer with every second. "It doesn't matter," Jack said finally, straightening up. His voice was steadier than mine would have been. "We're getting out of here. There's got to be something, a way out of town, a map, something." "Maybe back in the forest," Emma said quietly. Her voice wavered like she didn't want to suggest it. "The trail we saw earlier, the one by the gas station, it might lead somewhere." I wanted to argue. Going back into the woods felt like a death sentence, but as I looked around, I realized the alternative wasn't much better. The streets of Silent Creek were closing in on us, the houses shifting somehow, leaning inward as if listening, watching. Staying here wasn't an option. "Fine," I said. "We head for the woods, but we stick together. No one goes off alone. Got it?" We moved quickly, cutting through side streets that all looked the same. Every house was a mirror of the last. Rotting porches, shattered windows, Front doors half open, like mouths frozen mid-scream. Shadows lingered just out of sight, shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The fog was thicker now, a living thing slithering between us, muffling our footsteps. The forest appeared like a jagged tear at the edge of town. Blackened trees stretched upward, skeletal and lifeless, their branches twisted into shapes that looked too much like hands. The trail we'd seen before snaked through them, a thin line of dirt cutting through the undergrowth. I hesitated at the tree line. The forest felt wrong, hungry, almost as if it had been waiting for us. "You sure about this?" Tom asked, his voice tight. "No," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." The first step onto the path felt like crossing some invisible line. The forest swallowed the little light left in the sky, plunging us into shadows that thickened the farther we went. The air was colder here, damp and heavy. It clung to my skin, worming its way into my lungs like a poison I couldn't exhale. The silence was worse. Not even the wind stirred the leaves. There was no rustling, no birds, no light. Just our footsteps, loud and intrusive, like we were disturbing something ancient. Somewhere ahead, Sarah stumbled. She let out a sharp cry, and we turned to find her on the ground, staring at something in the dirt. Jack shined his flashlight down, and the beam caught it, a hole. No, not just a hole. A pit carved into the earth, the edges jagged and unnatural, as if something had clawed its way out. "It goes down forever," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. She was right. The pit stretched into absolute blackness, and the longer I stared, the more I swore I could hear something, a sound rising from below. It was faint at first, a soft murmur like voices just out of reach. Then it grew, building into a low, rhythmic chant. The words were unintelligible, but they crawled inside my head and settled there like parasites. "Move," Jack said, pulling Sarah back. "Don't look at it. Keep walking." But there were more. Dozens of them. Pits like wounds scattered throughout the forest floor. The chanting grew louder as we moved, echoing in every direction, until I couldn't tell if it was coming from above or below. I kept my eyes fixed on the path, forcing myself not to look down into those endless holes. Tom was the first to hear it, the footsteps behind us. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We froze. The forest pressed in around us, and the whispering seemed to stop, like it was listening too. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. At first, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then one of those shadows moved. A figure stepped into view between the trees. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and bent at impossible angles. It didn't walk so much as it shifted, each movement wrong, like it wasn't meant to exist in this world. "Go," Jack said, his voice shaking. "No." We ran, the forest blurring around us. The chanting returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices layered together, rising to a fever pitch. My flashlight bounced wildly, catching glimpses of more figures moving between the trees. They were everywhere now, shapes that twitched and crawled, closing in on us. The path ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center, the ground had collapsed into a massive crater, wider than any of the pits we'd seen. A foul stench rose from it, thick and choking, and the chanting became deafening. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me, vibrating through my skull. Behind us, the figures emerged from the trees, their faces obscured by shadow, their limbs moving with jerking, unnatural precision. One of them stepped forward, its mouth splitting open in a silent scream. I felt it then, the pull, a force dragging me toward the crater, stronger than anything I could fight. My legs moved on their own, stumbling closer to the edge. "Don't look," Jack shouted, grabbing my arm. His voice cut through the fog in my mind, snapping me back. I pulled away from the edge, gasping. The others were already running, and I forced my legs to move, dragging myself away from whatever waited below. We didn't stop until the trees thinned, and the fog gave way to a faint sliver of twilight. Silent Creek was still there, waiting for us. But something had changed. The forest had let us go, for now. But as I turned back, I saw them standing at the tree line, those figures watching, unmoving, waiting, and I knew we were out of time. Silent Creek wasn't going to let us leave. The mist curled at our feet as we stumbled back into Silent Creek. My chest heaved with every breath, and my legs felt like lead, dragging me forward step by step. Jack had taken the lead again, flashlight flickering weakly in his trembling hands, while Sarah followed close behind, her wide eyes darting from shadow to shadow, like she expected something to reach out and grab her. I couldn't blame her. I felt it too, that weight in the air, the suffocating sense of being watched. We didn't speak. The only sounds were our shoes scraping over cracked pavement and the faint hum of the forest behind us, like it was still alive, whispering in a language we couldn't understand. I tried to focus on the buildings ahead, but they'd changed, or maybe I was finally seeing them for what they really were. The houses leaned together like they were conspiring, their broken windows reflecting nothing but darkness. Shapes moved behind some of them, silent and slow, their outlines too vague to recognize. I wiped sweat from my face with the back of my hand. I couldn't shake the memory of the pit, of what I'd felt standing at its edge. It was more than just the pull. It was the sense of something looking back at me, something waiting. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if Jack hadn't grabbed me. The church loomed ahead, its crooked steeple stabbing upward like a jagged tooth against the bruised sky. Jack stopped in front of it, turning to face the rest of us. "We can't keep running blind," he said, his voice rough and low. "There has to be something here, a way out, or at least an answer." "What answers?" Tom muttered. "You saw those things. This place isn't normal. None of this is." Jack ignored him. "We missed something in the church. There has to be a reason all this started there." I wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at me to stay as far away from that building as possible. But he was right. We didn't have a plan. The car was dead. The woods were alive with things that weren't supposed to exist. Silent Creek was a labyrinth, one that twisted and turned until you lost yourself completely. So, against every ounce of better judgment, I nodded. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "Let's go." We stepped inside. The church was worse than I remembered. The air was colder here, carrying the sharp, coppery tang of something old and rotten. I kept close to Sarah, our footsteps muffled against the dust-caked floorboards. My flashlight caught glimpses of the statues, figures frozen mid-anguish, hands shielding their faces or clutching their own throats. I tried not to look at them, but I could feel their presence pressing in on me. It was like they were still aware somehow, even in their silence. Jack moved ahead, his beam sweeping the pulpit. "There," he said, pointing. The trapdoor. The trapdoor was just behind the pulpit, partially hidden beneath a rotting rug. Jack knelt and pried it open, the wood groaning in protest. The smell that rushed up was suffocating, worse than anything we'd encountered before. It reeked of mold, damp earth, and something I couldn't quite name, a smell that clawed its way into my sinuses and refused to leave. "Do we have to go down there?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled, barely audible. Jack didn't answer. He just swung the flashlight down into the opening. The light disappeared after a few feet, swallowed by shadows that seemed too thick to be natural. "There is something down there," he said, more to himself than to us. "Maybe answers, maybe a way out." Without waiting, he dropped down into the darkness. "Jack!" I hissed. I leaned over the edge, my flashlight flickering down into the gloom. I could barely see him, just the faint bounce of his beam moving through what looked like a stone passage. He called back, his voice muffled. "It's safe. I think it's some kind of basement. You need to see this. I didn't want to go down. I really didn't. But Jack's voice echoed strangely, almost vibrating in the air, like something deeper was speaking with him. The thought of leaving him down there alone pushed me to the edge of the trapdoor. I glanced at Sarah and Tom Ball. We stick together. Come on. One by one, we climbed down the ladder. My boots hit stone, the cold seeping up through the soles and into my bones. The basement stretched out before us, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone. The ceiling was low, forcing us to hunch slightly as we moved forward. Water dripped from somewhere unseen, the sound distant and hollow. Jack's flashlight swept across the floor, stopping at something halfway down the passage. "Look," he said, his voice cracking. I stepped closer, my beam falling over the same spot. Symbols had been carved into the floor, crude and ancient, their lines etched deep into the stone. They stretched out in a circular pattern, filling the entire room. In the center sat an altar. No, not an altar, a table, made of blackened wood, its surface scarred and stained. Something metallic glinted faintly in the light, half hidden beneath a layer of grime. A knife, long and jagged, the blade rusted but still sharp. Sarah gagged. "What is this?" Jack crouched, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "It's a ritual. This whole place, it's a ritual site." A low sound echoed through the tunnel then, freezing me in place. It was deep and rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. My flashlight dimmed suddenly, flickering as the air grew colder. I looked at the passage we'd come through, but it was gone. Swallowed by blackness that seemed alive, shifting and writhing like it was moving toward us. Something thudded in the darkness. Footsteps. Tom stumbled back, his breath ragged. "It's here. It's coming." The heartbeat grew louder, faster. The symbols on the floor seemed to shimmer, the lines bleeding red like fresh wounds. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the ladder. "Move. Get out." We bolted. The tunnel behind us roared with sound, the footsteps crashing like thunder now, so close they shook the walls. My flashlight barely worked, the beam guttering like it was suffocating under the weight of the dark. Jack climbed first, his hands slipping against the ladder's rusted rungs. Sarah went next, then Tom. I waited until they were almost clear, the noise rising to a deafening pitch behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something huge was in that tunnel, its presence pressing against my back like a physical weight. It was inches away, reaching, stretching. I scrambled up the ladder, the metal cutting into my palms, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. We burst back into the church in a heap, slamming the trapdoor shut behind us. The sound stopped, like someone had cut a cord, leaving the air thin and dead. I lay there on the floor, chest heaving, the scent of rot still thick in my nostrils. Jack sat up, his face pale, his hands stained red with dirt. Sarah's voice broke the silence, low and shaking. "We can't stay here." She was right. Whatever was down there, whatever had been waiting in the dark, it wasn't done with us. And now, it knew we were here. The air inside the church felt heavier now, like it was trying to crush us where we sat. I could still hear it, the sound, that rhythmic, deafening pulse from below, pounding through the trapdoor like it might burst through any second. It wasn't over. Whatever we disturbed in that tunnel, it was awake now, and it was waiting. Jack sat against the far wall, the flashlight limp in his hands. He hadn't said a word since we climbed out of the basement, his face pale and streaked with grime. Tom paced near the shattered windows, glancing out into the thickening fog that had crept closer to the church. His breathing was sharp and uneven, and I didn't blame him. Sarah was huddled in a pew, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes locked on the trapdoor, as if expecting it to fly open at any second. I sat in the middle of it all, staring at my own filthy hands. My palms still stung from gripping the ladder too hard, rust and dirt ground into the cuts. I could feel the shaking in my arms, the adrenaline wearing thin. I didn't dare speak. It felt like words would shatter the fragile silence we'd managed to crawl into. Tom finally broke it, his voice raw. "We can't stay here. We have to." He paused, looking for the words. "We have to do something. You all saw those symbols. That place, this town isn't just abandoned. There's something here, something real." His words stirred something in Jack, who looked up sharply, his eyes dark and hollow. "You think I don't know that?" He pushed himself to his feet, the flashlight flickering back to life as he moved. "You think I don't hear it? Feel it?" He gestured toward the trapdoor. "It's everywhere. Whatever this is, it's not going to let us walk away. It's already inside our heads." I swallowed hard. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The sound hadn't left me, not entirely. It pulsed in the back of my mind like a faint echo, just loud enough to remind me it was still there. I looked at Sarah. "You've been quiet. Did you see something down there?" She blinked, startled, as if I'd pulled her out of a trance. Slowly, she nodded. "It wasn't just a ritual," she whispered. "It was a sacrifice. Those symbols, they weren't just carved there to be seen. They were made to contain something." "Contain what?" Tom snapped. "Whatever's down there is already loose. Did you see the way it moved? Like the whole tunnel was alive. It was wrong." "Not loose," Sarah interrupted softly, shaking her head. "It's still trapped, but it's trying to get out. Those things, the figures in the forest, the ones in the tunnel, they're part of it, pieces of whatever's buried here." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I thought of the pits, how the ground had split open like wounds scattered through the forest. I thought of the pull I'd felt at the edge of the crater, the way the dark had seemed to breathe. Something wasn't just buried here. It was spreading. "Then we need to find a way to stop it," I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. My voice echoed strangely in the empty church. If those symbols were meant to hold it in, maybe there's a way to reinforce them. Jack's flashlight swept over the trapdoor again, his face twisted in thought. "We'll need to go back down there." The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. None of us wanted to go back, not after what we'd seen, what we'd felt. But what choice did we have? If we ran, Silent Creek would just pull us back. I'd seen the way the streets shifted, the forest twisted to keep us trapped. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just in Silent Creek. It was Silent Creek. And if we didn't stop it here, we'd never escape. Jack moved first, pulling the trapdoor open again. The stench poured out worse than before, like the earth itself was rotting. I grabbed Sarah's arm gently as she stood, her face pale and strained. "We'll be okay," I lied. "We'll fix this." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. One by one, we descended into the dark. The tunnel felt different this time, alive, almost pulsing, like it was breathing with us. My flashlight barely cut through the black, the beam shaking as I moved it across the walls. The symbols glistened faintly now, their grooves oozing something dark and sticky. I tried not to look too closely at it. The smell was worse here, sharp and coppery, clinging to my skin like oil. We stopped at the center of the chamber, the altar looming ahead like a jagged shadow. Jack knelt down and ran his fingers over the symbols carved into the floor, muttering to himself. "We need something to seal it, something that'll bind it back." Tom stared at him like he was insane. "And what, exactly, do you think we're supposed to use? You don't just throw salt on something like this and call it a day. It's blood." We all turned to Sarah. She stood rigid, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her voice was flat, hollow. "The ritual, the symbols were made with blood. That's why they're alive. It's the only way to reinforce them." The air seemed to thin around us, and I felt a cold wave of dread crawl up my spine. "You can't be serious." But Jack didn't argue. He pulled a knife from his pocket, a short, sharp blade that glinted in the light, and drew it across his palm before any of us could stop him. He winced as the blood welled up, dripping onto the nearest symbol. The reaction was immediate. The lines hissed and glowed faintly, as if drinking in the offering. "Do it," Jack said through gritted teeth. "All of you." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that altar as possible. But there was nowhere to go. Silent Creek would find us, and whatever was waiting beneath our feet was clawing closer to the surface. If this was the only way to hold it back, I had to try. I took the knife from Jack, the metal slick with his blood, and pressed it against my palm. The symbols burned brighter, the light crawling across the floor like veins of fire. The heartbeat returned, louder now, shaking the walls around us. The ground trembled, and the air grew so heavy I thought it might crush me where I stood. The light spread, pooling around the altar, until the chamber was bathed in crimson. Then it stopped. The light dimmed. The trembling ceased. The sound was gone. We stood there in silence, our breathing loud and ragged. My palm burned, and the blood still dripped from my fingers, but I didn't care. The darkness around us felt quieter. Still. "It worked," Sarah whispered. But as we turned to climb back to the surface, I heard it. A sound so faint, I almost missed it. A crack. And then laughter. Low, guttural laughter, echoing up from somewhere far, far below. The laughter crept up through the cracks in the earth, vibrating in my chest like a hum that had no end. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to sound like it was buried miles below. But that somehow made it worse. It wasn't mocking us. It wasn't angry. It was hungry. "Get out," Jack said, his voice so low I almost didn't hear him. He didn't look at us, just at the altar, where the symbols now glowed faintly, their light flickering like dying embers. "We need to get out, now." No one argued. We turned as one, the passage narrowing and pressing in tighter around us than before. I could still hear it beneath my feet, the sound threading through the cracks and spreading out like roots. The ground felt soft, like it was shifting under my boots. I gripped the ladder with trembling hands and climbed, my arms weak, the cuts on my palms stinging as I went. I was the last to climb out, and the moment my head broke the surface, Sarah and Tom slammed the trapdoor shut. Dust billowed up in choking clouds, filling the air with the sick, sweet scent of rot. Jack stood in the center of the church, his flashlight bouncing in his grip as he stared at the floor. I followed his gaze. The trapdoor was pulsing, slowly, like the heartbeat we'd heard in the tunnels had followed us up and settled just beneath the wood. "What do we do now?" Tom's voice cracked, sweat dripping down his face. "You heard that thing. You felt it." No one answered. Jack paced in tight, frantic circles, his boots thudding too loudly against the church floor. His flashlight swayed wildly, scattering light across the darkened room. I could still hear the faint rumble beneath us, like it was moving, growing, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The quiet didn't last. A sharp, deafening bang rang out from the far end of the church, the echo rattling the walls. I flinched, the sound splintering straight through my chest like a knife. My flashlight flicked to the back wall, just in time to see it. A door I hadn't noticed before, warped and crooked, rattling violently on its hinges. Something was behind it, pushing. "We need to leave." Sarah's voice was tight and thin, but she didn't move. None of us did. The sound of the door grew louder, shaking the entire wall with every hit. Dust rained down in thin, choking clouds. Another hit, harder this time, and the wood split down the center like kindling. Whatever it was coming through. "Move!" Jack shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and dragging her toward the front doors. Tom and I followed, but the church was fighting us. I swear it was. The pews seemed to shift as we ran, twisting in ways that didn't make sense, like the building itself was alive and trying to trap us. The front doors wouldn't budge. I threw myself against them, my shoulder screaming in protest as the wood refused to give way. Behind me, the sound of the splintering door grew louder, closer. I could feel it pressing against me, like the air had turned to liquid. "Help me!" I shouted. Jack joined me, both of us slamming against the doors with everything we had. The hinges groaned. One more hit and the doors flew open, a wall of mist swallowing us as we tumbled outside. The moment my feet hit the ground, I felt it. Silent Creek was different now. The fog was thicker, swirling in angry, churning currents, pressing against my skin like it was trying to seep inside. The streets no longer looked real. Houses leaned at impossible angles, their windows dark and yawning. The trees that bordered the edge of the town twisted and stretched upward, their branches clawing at the sky. There was no wind, no sound, but I could feel something moving beneath it all. Watching, waiting. Jack grabbed my arm. "We need to find the tunnels again. The mines. If the symbols can't hold that thing, we'll bury it." "What?" I stared at him. "You want to go back underground? Are you insane?" "We don't have a choice." Jack's voice cracked. "You saw what's happening. It's spreading. If we don't stop at this place, it won't stop with Silent Creek. It'll spread like a disease. You think it'll let us leave?" His words hung in the air, sharp and cold, and I realized he was right. Silent Creek wouldn't let us go, not while that thing was waking up. We ran. The streets bent and twisted beneath us, turning sharp corners that shouldn't have existed, leading us deeper into the town. I didn't know if we were heading toward the mines or running straight into a trap, but it didn't matter. I could hear it now, everywhere. The heart beat. The laughter. The ground trembled beneath us like it was alive, breathing with us, matching our steps. The entrance to the mines was worse than I'd imagined. A gaping maw carved into the earth, framed by rusted tracks that vanished into absolute darkness. The mist clung to the opening, curling inward like it was being sucked inside. Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a lantern hanging by the old entrance and lit it with shaking hands, the flame flickering weakly, as if the darkness was trying to swallow it whole. "Stay close," he muttered. "And don't stop." We stepped into the mine, the tunnel walls closing around us like a fist. The deeper we went, the more the sound changed. It wasn't just a heartbeat anymore. It was breathing. Low, guttural, and constant. My flashlight skimmed across old beams and rusted tools, but the shadows twisted around the light, moving on their own. Something wasn't right. The air felt thicker here, and the lantern flame barely flickered now. It was as if the darkness was pressing against us, trying to smother the light. And then I saw it. Carved into the rock at the end of the tunnel was another symbol, massive this time, stretching floor to ceiling, its lines jagged and imperfect. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. "It's not sealed," Sarah whispered. Her voice cracked as she pointed to the center of the symbol. A crack split through it, wide and deep, oozing that same dark substance from the church basement. It dripped like tar, hissing when it touched the ground. "It's breaking," Jack said. "We're running out of time." Before I could respond, the tunnel trembled. The ground split beneath my feet, knocking me onto my back. My flashlight skittered away, its beam cutting wildly through the dark. From the crack in the symbol, something began to rise. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadows peeled away, and a shape emerged, tall and unnatural, its limbs too long, its body shifting like smoke caught in a storm. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. And for the first time, the whispering turned to words, low, rasping, and terrible. "You woke me up. Now you belong to me." The words echoed through the mine, vibrating in the air like they carried a weight I couldn't understand. My skin went cold, the hair on the back of my neck rising. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from the shape pulling itself free from the crack in the stone. Its form was shifting, smoke and shadow 1 second, flesh and bone the next. It twisted unnaturally, unfolding limbs that seemed endless, bending in ways that no living thing should. I still couldn't see its face, but I felt it watching me, its presence a pressure that tightened around my chest like a vice. "Jack!" I gasped, my voice breaking. "We need to go." Jack was frozen, lantern trembling in his hands, the dim light flickering uselessly against the shape that towered over us. Sarah pulled at his sleeve, her voice high and panicked. "Jack, please, move!" It took a second for him to snap out of it, but then he grabbed the lantern and started backing up. Tom was already pulling Sarah toward the entrance, and I stumbled after them, my legs numb and weak. The creature's voice, if you could even call it a voice, rumbled from the depths of the tunnel, vibrating through the rock, through me. It didn't shout or scream. It whispered, low and guttural, the words soaked in something ancient and hateful. "You will never leave." The tunnel began to shake. Dust and bits of rock rained down from the ceiling, and the air grew impossibly heavy, making it hard to breathe. I looked back just once, just a glimpse, and I saw it. The shadows crawled across the floor and walls, snaking toward us like living veins, reaching with fingers that stretched and clawed for my feet. The thing moved, its form gliding closer, its limbs dragging with an awful scrape that made my stomach twist. "Run!" I shouted, though I could barely hear myself over the roaring sound that filled the tunnel. It was everywhere, like the earth itself was screaming. The mine was collapsing around us, beams splintering, the walls cracking open like a wound. I kept my head down, pushing forward as fast as I could. I could hear the others just ahead, Sarah's sobs, Tom's strained breathing, Jack shouting something I couldn't make out. And then I felt it. The cold. It started at my feet, a numbing chill that spread up my legs like ice water. I risked a glance behind me, and the shadows were there, crawling over the ground, spreading like a wave of darkness, swallowing everything. "Go, go, go!" Jack's voice cut through the noise, and I saw him and Tom pull Sarah up through the mouth of the mine, their silhouettes barely visible in the thick swirling fog outside. I lunged for the entrance, the cold at my heels, the shadows brushing against the soles of my shoes. My fingers scraped against the rock as I pulled myself free. The moment my feet hit solid ground, I collapsed onto the dirt, chest heaving, lungs burning. Behind me, the mine let out a deafening groan, the earth splitting wide as the tunnel caved in. A cloud of dust and smoke burst from the entrance, carrying with it the sound, the heartbeat, the whispers, the laughter, until all that remained was silence. I sat up slowly, coughing, my eyes stinging. Jack was on his knees, staring at the collapsed entrance, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. Tom was slumped against a tree, his head tipped back, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Sarah sat a few feet away, curled into herself, shaking. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the mist, now eerily quiet, swirling around the edge of the forest like it was retreating. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe we'd sealed it, buried whatever that thing was back in the dark where it belonged. But Silent Creek didn't feel empty. It didn't feel finished. Jack stood first, his movements slow and stiff. He looked down at his bloody hands, the cuts on his palms still oozing, and then at the mine entrance, where dust was settling over the ruined ground. "Did we stop it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. No one answered. I didn't have an answer. It felt like we'd escaped something bigger than we could understand, something that wasn't bound by rules we could see. I glanced toward the town, where the fog hung thick and still. The houses were waiting, dark and silent, their broken windows like empty eyes. "We need to leave," I said quietly, forcing myself to stand. My legs felt like they might buckle, but I pushed through it. "The car, maybe we can get it running," We have to try. Sarah looked at me, her face pale and hollow. It won't let us leave, she whispered. You know that, don't you? I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't want to believe it. We moved through the forest as quickly as we could, every step pulling us farther from the mine, farther from whatever waited in the dark. But the woods were different now. The trees leaned closer, their branches twisting overhead like they were trying to close us in. The path we'd followed earlier was gone, swallowed by roots and overgrowth that hadn't been there before. I could feel the town behind us, pressing against my back like a shadow that wouldn't leave. By the time we stumbled out of the woods and back onto the main road, the car was still there. It looked smaller now, fragile, and out of place in a world that had started to unravel. Jack climbed into the driver's seat, shoving the keys into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine turned over once, twice. For a second, it felt like Silent Creek would win. Then, with a sputtering growl, the car came to life. We didn't look back as we drove. None of us spoke. The road twisted and stretched in ways I couldn't remember, the fog curling just beyond the edges of the headlights, always there, always watching. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it, the shape, the shadows, something following us. But there was nothing, just darkness. Hours passed, maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. The road finally straightened, and the fog broke apart, fading into nothing. The mountains rose up on either side, the sky lightening to a dull gray as the first hints of morning crept over the horizon. We didn't stop until we hit the edge of a small gas station miles away from Silent Creek. Jack killed the engine. None of us moved. Tom was the first to speak, his voice a ragged whisper. Is it over? I didn't answer. I just sat there, staring at the dirt-caked windshield, the dried blood on my hands. The silence was wrong somehow, too quiet. I could still hear it in the back of my mind, that faint whisper, threading through the cracks. When I finally looked into the rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. There, far down the road, just visible in the pale light of dawn, the fog was still there. The road to Black Ridge Lodge was narrow, snaking through a labyrinth of ancient trees that rose like silent sentinels on either side. Their gnarled branches tangled overhead, weaving into a canopy that strangled out the sunlight. The further we drove, the deeper the forest seemed to stretch, like the woods themselves were pulling us in. The silence inside the car was thick. Even the music we'd been playing earlier had faded into a crackle of static before Jess turned it off entirely. It was as if the forest didn't want any noise, just the low hum of the tires rolling over gravel and the occasional creak of our packed SUV. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur past, feeling the weight of something I couldn't name settle in my chest. The air was different here, older. It carried a damp chill that seeped through the windows and clung to my skin. I tightened my hoodie around me and glanced over my shoulder. Chloe sat in the back, staring out the window, earbuds in, her foot tapping silently to whatever was playing. Matt was next to her, arms folded, his head tipped back like he was napping, though I knew better. No one was really relaxed. We were all waiting to reach the lodge, waiting for this unsettling stretch of road to finally end. When the lodge came into view, my breath caught. It was larger than I'd imagined, sprawling and uneven, the wooden beams darkened with age and weather. It sat at the edge of a clearing, the forest creeping in close on all sides, almost like the trees were trying to reclaim it. The roof sloped at sharp, unnatural angles, and the windows, too many windows, reflected nothing but a dull gray sky. A porch stretched across the front of the lodge, its planks warped and splintered. It should have looked inviting, warm even, but it didn't. The lodge wasn't abandoned. It wasn't alive. It just was, sitting there like it had always been and always would be. Matt whistled softly as he climbed out of the car. "It's bigger than I thought," he said, though his voice didn't carry the usual excitement. It was like the lodge had taken the edge off of us all. We unloaded the car, and the forest watched. I felt it pressing in on my back, that same heaviness, like 100 eyes were staring through the shadows. Every rustling leaf sounded too deliberate. Every creak of wood beneath my feet felt sharp and wrong. The lodge door opened with a low groan, like it hadn't been touched in years, though someone had clearly been here recently enough to keep the place running. Inside was worse. The air smelled faintly of mildew and dust, like old paper left to decay in a forgotten attic. The floorboards beneath the rug creaked, and shadows pooled in the corners of the room, as though the light from the small chandelier didn't dare stretch too far. The entryway led into a large living room, with an oversized stone fireplace at one end, and mismatched, aging furniture scattered across the space. Animal heads lined the walls, their glass eyes glossy and unseeing. A bear, a moose, a wolf, all staring out over the room as if keeping silent vigil. "We're really out here, huh?" Jess muttered, her voice soft but carrying in the stillness. She was right. The isolation pressed against us in a way that was hard to ignore. There were no neighbors, no distant hum of cars, no sounds of life. Just us and the lodge. I thought it would feel freeing, but it didn't. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where no one would find us if we disappeared. It didn't take long for us to settle in. The lodge had 2 floors, each hallway stretching longer than seemed possible from the outside. Doors lined both sides, some locked, others leading into empty, silent rooms with peeling wallpaper and dusty curtains. I chose the first room on the left upstairs. It was small and smelled faintly of cedar, with a narrow bed shoved against one wall and a small window that overlooked the forest. The trees pressed right up against the glass, so close I felt like they might swallow the lodge whole if I blinked. That first hour passed quietly, too quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. No signal. I tried to shake the unease, but it settled deeper with each passing second. I heard footsteps in the hallway, a slow, deliberate creak, and looked toward the door. Nothing. Just the empty hall stretching into darkness, the last rays of daylight filtering through the windows. "Dinner's ready." Matt's voice boomed suddenly from downstairs, shattering the silence and making me jump. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to move. We ate in the living room, crowded onto the couches and armchairs with plates balanced on our laps. Matt tried to lighten the mood, telling stories about college, about road trips, about anything that wasn't this place, but it fell flat. Chloe was quiet. Jess kept glancing toward the windows, though they reflected only darkness now. I didn't look. I couldn't. I didn't want to see what might be staring back. And then the lights flickered. It happened so fast, I almost thought I imagined it. But the others froze too, staring at the chandelier as it swayed slightly. The shadows in the corners seemed to crawl a little closer. The air grew colder. I rubbed my arms, glancing at the fireplace. The fire was still burning, but it didn't seem to give off any heat. "That's normal, right?" Matt said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Old wiring or something?" No one answered. Jess was the first to break. She set her plate down and stood abrupt. "I'm going to bed," she muttered, heading for the stairs without looking back. We all followed soon after. My room felt different this time, heavier, colder. I stood at the window for a long time, staring out into the darkness, where the trees swayed without wind. For a second, I thought I saw something move between them, a shape, tall and thin, shifting just beyond the edge of the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. The floor creaked outside my room. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, and listened. Slow, heavy footsteps moved down the hall, pausing just outside my door. I held my breath. The handle didn't move. The door didn't open, but I could feel it, something standing there, just beyond the wood. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the lodge breathing around me. The footsteps came back at some point, circling the hallway, stopping at each door, listening. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, praying for daylight that felt like it would never come. The morning brought no comfort. I don't remember when I finally drifted off, but I woke to a dull gray light leaking through the thin curtains. The cold was worse now, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. My body ached, as if I'd spent the night curled in on myself, fighting against something I couldn't see. I sat up slowly, listening. The lodge was silent, unnaturally so. No voices, no creaking floorboards, no hum of life. Just quiet. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet brushing against the icy floor. The memory of last night came flooding back. The footsteps in the hall, the stillness in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing against my door. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake it off. It had to be my imagination, this place getting under my skin. Old houses made noises. Shadows played tricks. That's what I told myself. When I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. The air felt thicker here, heavy with the smell of wood rot and something faintly metallic. The floor creaked under me, but it didn't sound like a normal creak. It was sharper, almost like the house was reacting to me. I forced myself to ignore it, pushing forward my steps careful and slow. Downstairs I found Matt sitting in the living room, poking at the dying embers in the fireplace with a piece of metal. His hair was a mess, and dark circles rimmed his eyes. He didn't look up when I walked in, just kept jabbing at the ash like he was trying to punish it. "Did you sleep?" I asked. My voice sounded wrong in the quiet. Too loud. Matt grunted. "Not really. This place is... well..." He paused, choosing his words. "Noisy." I didn't argue. Instead, I moved to the window and peeled back the curtain. The trees were still there, crowding the edge of the clearing, their branches bare and twisted like bony fingers. But there was something different. The ground looked disturbed, like someone had been out there in the night, dragging something heavy across the frost-covered dirt. I frowned, following the faint lines until they disappeared into the shadows of the woods. "Where are Jess and Chloe?" I asked, letting the curtain drop back into place. "Chloe's in the kitchen, I think. Jess..." Matt's voice trailed off. He finally looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. She left early. I heard the front door open around dawn." I stared at him. "She left? Alone?" Matt nodded slowly, jabbing the poker back into the ashes. "Said she needed some air, that she felt like the house was closing in on her." A chill crept up my spine. Jess was stubborn, sure, but wandering off into the woods alone in a place like this wasn't her. I tried to ignore the gnawing unease in my chest as I turned toward the kitchen. Chloe was there, sitting at the old wooden table, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't look up when I walked in, her gaze fixed on the chipped mug in front of her. Steam curled from whatever was inside, but she wasn't drinking it. "Jess went outside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you see her?" Chloe shook her head. "No, but I heard her. She was talking to someone." My stomach dropped. "Talking to who?" Chloe's fingers curled tighter around the mug, her knuckles white. "I don't know. It didn't sound like her." The words hung in the air, sinking into my bones like ice. I turned away, my heart pounding as I moved back into the living room. "We need to find her," I said to Matt, who was still hunched by the fire. She could be lost. He looked at me, his face pale. What if she's not? The question hung there, sharp and ugly. I didn't answer. I grabbed my jacket, pulling it on as I headed for the front door. Matt stood reluctantly, shoving his feet into his boots. Chloe didn't move from the kitchen. I glanced back at her one last time, and for a second, she looked different, her face somehow older, her eyes darker. But when I blinked, it was gone. The cold outside hit me like a wall. The sky was a flat, unbroken gray, the sun hidden somewhere behind it. The ground crunched under my boots as we moved toward the tree line. Marks I'd seen from the window were clearer now, deep grooves, like someone had dragged something heavy from the house to the woods. We followed them. The forest was worse up close. The trees pressed together so tightly the branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the light. The air here was colder, sharper, like it hadn't been touched by warmth in years. Every step felt wrong, like the ground didn't want us there. The tracks led deeper, winding through the trees until we reached a clearing. Jess stood at the center of it, her back to us. Relief hit me like a punch. "Jess," I called, moving forward. "What the hell are you doing out here?" She didn't turn. She didn't move. Matt grabbed my arm, his grip too tight. "Wait." I stopped, staring at her. She was still wearing the clothes from last night, a sweater and jeans, but they looked wrong somehow, too thin against the cold. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if she were listening to something. I opened my mouth to call her name again, but then I saw it. The ground around her was wrong. The frost had melted in a perfect circle, the earth black and wet. Lines had been carved into the dirt, symbols I didn't recognize, stretching out like veins. And Jess, her feet weren't touching the ground. She floated. A low sound rose in my ears, vibrating through my skull. It started like a whisper, but it grew louder with every passing second. A chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. Jess's head turned slowly, too slowly, until her face was staring back at us. Her eyes were wrong, black and glossy, reflecting nothing. "Leave," she said, but it wasn't her voice. It was layered, like 100 voices speaking through her. "You don't belong here." The whispering grew louder, building into a roar that made my head ache. The ground beneath Jess cracked, a fissure spreading outward, black and empty. Matt grabbed my arm, pulling me back, shouting something I couldn't hear. I stumbled, my boots slipping in the frozen dirt, but I couldn't look away. Jess smiled, wide and unnatural. Her mouth stretched too far, her teeth too sharp. Then the ground swallowed her whole. The whispering stopped. The forest went silent. I stared at the spot where she'd been, the blackened earth still smoldering faintly. Matt was yelling at me, pulling me back toward the lodge, but I couldn't move. Jess was gone. And as I looked back toward the house, I realized something else. We went alone in the woods. The trees were full of shadows, standing just out of focus. Watching, waiting. The silence inside the lodge felt even worse after the woods. It wasn't the comforting stillness of being indoors, safe from the cold. It was wrong, the kind of silence you hear when you're somewhere you shouldn't be. When we stumbled back through the front door, Matt slammed it shut behind us, his face pale and his breath sharp in the freezing air. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He locked the door, like a deadbolt would keep whatever was out there from getting in. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying the moment Jess smiled, how her mouth had stretched wide, how the forest had swallowed her. It wasn't natural. None of it was. I felt sick, my stomach twisting in knots, but I shoved the feeling down and wiped my damp hands on my jeans. Chloe was still at the kitchen table where we'd left her. She didn't look up as we entered, her gaze fixed on the surface of the table, her fingers drumming against the wood in a slow, uneven rhythm. At first, I thought she was just zoning out, but when I stepped closer, I realized she was whispering something under her breath, words I couldn't catch, spoken too softly to understand. "Chloe?" I said her name gently, like I might spook her. She didn't react. Her fingers just kept tapping, her lips moving. I touched her shoulder. She stopped. The moment she froze, the quiet around us seemed to tighten, like the lodge itself had been waiting for her to notice us. She looked up slowly, her eyes glassy and unfocused, as if she'd just woken up. For a second, I swore her pupils looked too large, almost swallowing the irises, but the thought disappeared when she blinked. "Where did you go?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Matt stared at her from the doorway, his face pale. "The woods," he said flatly. "We were looking for Jess." At the mention of Jess's name, Chloe flinched, her fingers curling into fists on the table. "Don't say her name," she said quickly, almost too quickly. Her eyes darted toward the window, the curtain drawn tightly shut. "They're listening." A chill ran through me. Who's listening? Chloe looked at me then, really looked at me, and something about her expression made my throat tighten. "You don't want to know," she whispered. I stepped back. Something had changed in her, something subtle but undeniable. She was still Chloe, but it was like the edges of her had blurred, like the lodge itself had seeped into her bones. Matt met my gaze over her head, his expression asking the same question I didn't want to say out loud. What happened while we were gone? The house creaked, then, just a low, dragging groan, like old wood settling, but it sounded wrong, too deliberate. We all froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, from somewhere upstairs. My pulse spiked. "Someone's up there," Matt said. "It's just the house," I tried, though even I didn't believe it. Another sound followed, footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps, moving across the floor above us, pacing back and forth. We stared at the ceiling, silent, as the steps grew louder. "They shouldn't be up there," Chloe said softly. "Who?" I snapped, my voice too sharp. I was done with her cryptic whispers and vacant stares. "Who shouldn't be up there, Chloe?" She didn't answer. She just smiled faintly, like she knew something we didn't, and whispered, "They never left." A sudden bang shook the ceiling above us, like something heavy had dropped to the floor, and the footsteps stopped. Matt jumped, swearing under his breath. I looked at the stairs, the banister disappearing into shadow where the light didn't reach. I didn't want to go up there. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay put, to leave it alone, but we couldn't. "Let's check it out," Matt said, though his voice was shaky. He grabbed a flashlight from the fireplace mantel and handed it to me. The beam cut through the dim hallway as we climbed the stairs. The steps creaked under our weight, each one groaning in protest. The air was colder up here, heavy with the smell of dust and something faintly sour. I shined the light down the hall, and the shadows shifted, pulling back just beyond the beam's reach. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. We walked slowly, checking each one, Matt's hand tight around the crowbar he had grabbed before we came up. Every room was empty, just sagging beds, peeling wallpaper, and curtains that hung too still, as if the air itself had stopped moving. When we reached the last door at the end of the hall, we paused. This door was different. It was older, made of darker wood, with a handle that looked like it had been polished by 1,000 hands. My stomach turned as I stared at it. I couldn't explain why, but I knew something was waiting behind that door. "Open it," Matt said. "You open it," I shot back. He didn't argue. He grabbed the handle and twisted it slowly. The latch clicked, and the door creaked inward, revealing darkness. I lifted the flashlight, my heart pounding, and the beam swept across the room. It wasn't a bedroom. It was smaller, the walls bare, with a low ceiling that seemed to press downward. At the center of the room was a chair, old and wooden, sitting directly beneath a hook hanging from the ceiling. The hook was rusted, its edges jagged, and something dark stained the floor beneath it. "What the hell is this?" Matt muttered. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the walls, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the wood, etched deep into the walls and floor were symbols, the same ones I'd seen in the clearing. They spiraled outward from the chair like veins, their lines sharp and jagged, cutting into the surface like scars. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, as though it were alive, pressing against my chest. "Let's go," Matt said, backing up. "We shouldn't be in here." But I couldn't move. My flashlight froze on the chair, where something sat crumpled on the seat. Something small. I stepped closer, my breath hitching. It was a doll. A porcelain doll, its face cracked, one eye missing, the other staring blankly ahead. Its tiny dress was stained dark, the fabric torn and frayed. And then it moved. Just a twitch, its head jerking slightly to the side, as though it had just noticed me. I stumbled back, knocking into Matt. The flashlight hit the floor, spinning wildly, the beam cutting across the walls and ceiling. In that split second I saw it, a shape in the corner. A shadow, too tall and too thin, with arms that stretched down to the floor. The door slammed shut. The darkness swallowed us whole. The darkness was absolute. It pressed against me like a weight, smothering the air, choking out every instinct except one: run. The door was gone, just smooth, icy wood where it had been. Matt was next to me, his breathing loud and ragged in the silence. My flashlight lay on the floor, its beam shattered into jagged slices as it spun. For one brief, impossible moment, I saw the room in fragments, the symbols carved into the walls, the rusted hook swaying faintly above the chair, and that thing in the corner. It didn't move. Not yet. It just stood there, too tall, too thin, its form twisting in the broken light like smoke, its arms stretching down so far its claw-like fingers brushed the floor. The worst part was its face. There wasn't one. Just a hollow void where a face should have been, the edges writhing like the darkness was alive. "Where's the door?" Matt's voice broke the silence. His words were thin, almost swallowed by the weight of the room. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was screaming, trying to process what I was seeing. The flashlight stopped spinning. It came to rest on the chair, its beam fixed and steady. The doll was gone. I grabbed Matt's arm. "We need to move." His head jerked toward me, his eyes wide. "Where? There's nowhere to." The sound cut him off. A sharp, dry scrape, like nails dragging over stone. It came from the corner. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow moved, its limbs unfolding in sick, unnatural jerks. My pulse spiked, my chest squeezing tight as I backed up, dragging Matt with me. The scraping followed us, each movement accompanied by the low creak of the floorboards, the sound vibrating through my bones. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse now, like they were alive, glowing faintly with a sick, reddish light. My skin prickled with heat, and the air grew thicker, filled with a foul, metallic stench. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands slick with sweat. "There has to be a way out," I hissed, scanning the walls. There wasn't. The door was gone. The walls had no seams, no gaps, nothing but those jagged carvings that seemed to stretch and twist like veins. The thing in the corner was closer now, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't walk so much as it shifted, flickering like an image that couldn't quite hold itself together. The darkness bled from it, spreading across the floor, snuffing out what little light the flashlight offered. "Alex," Matt choked. I didn't let him finish. I lunged for the chair. It wasn't a plan, just instinct. The doll had been there before it disappeared, and that had to mean something. The moment I touched the wood, the room screamed. The sound was impossible, high-pitched and layered, like hundreds of voices shrieking at once. The symbols on the walls blazed, the light blinding, and the shadow in the corner stopped. It froze mid-movement, its form shuddering, as if the light was keeping it at bay. "Help me!" I shouted at Matt, my voice hoarse. "The chair. Move it." He didn't hesitate. Together, we shoved the chair toward the center of the room, the legs scraping against the floor. As we moved it, the glow from the symbols grew brighter, the red light spilling over the walls and ceiling, swallowing everything. The shadow recoiled, its form shaking violently as the darkness bled away, its edges curling like burning paper. And then, the door was there. It wasn't gradual, it just appeared, a jagged crack of light cutting through the wall behind us. Matt grabbed my arm, yanking me toward it, and I stumbled forward, the flashlight tumbling from my hand. The shadow let out a sound, low and guttural, vibrating through the room like a growl, but we didn't look back. We threw ourselves through the door and into the hallway, collapsing onto the warped wooden floor. The door slammed shut behind us with a final, echoing boom. For a long time, neither of us moved. I lay there, my face pressed against the cold floor, trying to breathe through the sharp ache in my chest. The lodge was silent again. No voices, no scraping, just the faint creak of the old wood settling beneath us. Matt was the first to sit up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a wild, desperate look I'd never seen before. "What the hell was that?" His voice cracked. I pushed myself up, my body shaking. My mind was still racing, but I couldn't let myself think about it. "Not yet." "I don't know," I whispered, but it was real. Matt stared at the door, now just a normal, battered piece of wood, as if nothing had happened. "We're leaving," he said suddenly. "Right now. Screw this place. I don't care if we have to walk through the woods for days. We're getting out." He wasn't wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get as far away from this place as possible. But as I opened my mouth to agree, a sound froze me in place. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the stairs below us, slow, deliberate, the same uneven beat Chloe had been drumming on the kitchen table. I turned to look at Matt, and I could tell he heard it too. His eyes darted to the staircase, his face pale. The tapping grew louder, echoing up the walls, filling the hallway like a heartbeat. Chloe's voice drifted up from the first floor, clear and calm in the silence. "They don't like it when you touch their things." Matt grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the door. We stumbled down the hall, the tapping following us like it was stitched into the walls themselves. As we reached the stairs, I looked down. Chloe stood at the bottom, staring up at us. Her face was blank, her arms hanging limp at her sides. For a moment, it didn't look like her at all. Her skin seemed too pale, her eyes too dark, and when she tilted her head, I swear, I heard something crack. "Where's Jess?" she asked softly. The question hung there, sharp and cold. I couldn't answer. My mind was spinning, the image of the shadow in the corner burning behind my eyes. "Where's Jess?" Chloe repeated, louder this time. The lodge groaned around us, the sound low and deep, like it was breathing. Matt pulled me back, his hand gripping mine tightly, and I didn't resist. We turned and ran, the hallway stretching too far, the floor creaking and bending beneath us. Somewhere behind us, Chloe began to laugh. It wasn't her laugh. It was layered, broken, and wrong, echoing through the halls like it came from every direction at once. The sound followed us, growing louder, drowning out everything else. We didn't stop running. The hallway twisted as we ran, stretching endlessly into a warped, impossible distance. My legs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the sound of Chloe's laughter, that laugh, paced us like a storm. It echoed off the walls, crawling into my skull, each note sharper than the last. It wasn't hers. It was something else entirely, wearing her voice like a mask. We hit the stairs, our footsteps thundering down the wood that groaned beneath our weight. The lodge shifted around us, the walls creaking, the air growing heavier with each passing second. It felt like the house was alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. I could feel it in my bones, a hum just beneath my skin, low and buzzing, making my teeth ache. Matt barreled through the front door first, throwing it open so hard it slammed against the wall. I stumbled after him into the cold, my boots slipping against the frost-covered ground as I fought to stay upright. The air outside hit me like ice, biting into my lungs and stinging my skin. For a second, it felt almost normal, quiet, still, like the forest might have swallowed the sounds of the house. But the lodge stood behind us, looming and silent, its windows black and empty. Matt stopped just ahead, bent over with his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. I glanced back at the house, my pulse pounding so hard it felt like my veins would burst. The lodge watched us. I swear it did. The shadows pooled at the edges of the porch, darker than they should have been, shifting like something just beneath the surface was moving, waiting. "We can't stay here," Matt rasped, lifting his head. His face was pale, his eyes wild, darting from me to the tree line and back. "The car. Let's get the hell out of here." "The car's dead," I said, my voice cracking. "You know it is." "Then we walk," he shot back, straightening. "I don't care how far. I'm not staying another second in this place." I didn't argue. He was right. Whatever was in that lodge, whatever we'd woken up, wasn't going to let us sleep, wasn't going to let us breathe. I started to follow him, the frost crunching under my feet, but then I stopped. Something was wrong. The forest had changed. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought I was imagining it. The trees were closer together, their branches twisted tighter, reaching out like skeletal hands. The trail that led back to the road was gone, replaced with thick, unbroken underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, my chest tightening. The clearing felt smaller now, like it was shrinking around us. Matt noticed it too. "Where's the path?" he said, his voice sharp and panicked. "It was right here. We drove straight in." I didn't answer. My gaze drifted to the lodge again, where the windows seemed darker now, deeper, like they were absorbing the light. A shiver crept through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. A noise broke the silence. A soft, wet scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. Matt froze, his eyes locking onto the tree line. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The sound came again, closer this time. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears, and scanned the edge of the clearing. At first I didn't see anything, just shadows shifting between the trees. But then I saw it. Something was moving in the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, dragging behind it like they didn't belong. It moved slowly, deliberately, its body flickering in and out of focus, as if it were struggling to hold its shape. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at us. I felt it. Matt grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "Run." We turned and bolted for the lodge. I didn't want to go back inside, but there was nowhere else to go. The forest was gone, replaced with an endless wall of trees that stretched impossibly high, blotting out the sky. The sound followed us, the scraping, the wet drag of something that didn't belong in this world. The front door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my chest aching. Matt paced across the living room, his hands pulling at his hair. "We're trapped," he muttered, his voice shaking. "We're trapped. It won't let us leave." The floor creaked above us, slow, heavy footsteps moving across the second floor. We both froze, the sound vibrating through the walls, settling into my bones like a second heartbeat. Matt's gaze snapped to mine. "It's upstairs." I swallowed hard. "We're not going up there again." The footsteps stopped. The air went still. And then, from the kitchen, we heard it. Tap, dot, bite. Tap, dot, tap, buddy. The same rhythm Chloe had drummed on the table. I turned slowly, my heart stuttering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, sharper, until it sounded like it was right behind us. Matt spun toward the sound, but I saw it first. Chloe stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her hair was matted, her skin pale, but it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were black, so black they seemed to pull the light from the room. She smiled, her lips stretching too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice layered. Dozens of voices speaking in unison. Matt grabbed my wrist, yanking me toward the stairs. We ran without thinking, our feet slamming against the wood, the tapping following us, louder and faster. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Chloe's laughter rose behind us, broken and shrill, echoing through the lodge like it was coming from every room at once. We reached the second floor, darting into the nearest room. Matt shoved the door shut, bracing it with his back as I stumbled across the floor. The room was freezing, my breath fogging the air. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was silence. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like wind through cracks in the walls. But it grew louder, words I couldn't understand, spoken in a voice that was too low and too deep. I backed toward the window, my eyes darting around the room. The walls were moving. The symbols, those same jagged carvings, were crawling across the plaster like veins. Matt's breathing hitched. "It's in the walls." The whispering turned into a roar, shaking the room, the symbols glowing faintly red. The floorboards trembled beneath us. I looked out the window, desperate for any way out, and froze. The forest was gone. In its place was nothing. Just endless black, stretching into eternity, as if the world outside had been swallowed whole. And reflected in the glass, standing right behind me, was Chloe. Her face was wrong, stretched and hollow, her eyes pits of darkness. Her mouth opened, wider and wider, splitting her face like a wound, and she whispered in that terrible layered voice, "Let me in." The window shattered. The window exploded inward with a force that felt impossible, shards of glass slicing through the air like teeth. I dove sideways, hitting the wooden floor hard, my shoulders screaming as I rolled to a stop. Cold air surged through the room, sharp and biting, carrying with it that same foul, metallic stench, the smell of decay, of something old and rotting just out of sight. "Matt!" I shouted, scrambling to my knees. My ears were ringing, my vision swimming as I scanned the room. Matt was slumped against the far wall, his hands covering his face, his breathing shallow and ragged. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was louder now, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the air itself. Words I couldn't understand, layered and broken, spoken in voices that didn't sound human. The symbols carved into the walls were glowing brighter, their edges bleeding red like open wounds, and in the center of it all, just beyond the shattered window, Chloe stood watching. Or something that looked like Chloe. Her hair whipped in the wind, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her black eyes fixed on me with an emptiness that chilled my blood. Her mouth moved, her lips stretching too wide, the whispers spilling from her throat without pause. Her skin was pale and cracked, like porcelain left in the cold too long. And as the light from the symbols pulsed brighter, she stepped through the window. She didn't climb. She didn't stumble. She moved. Her feet never touched the floor. Matt groaned behind me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Chloe, or whatever this thing had become, floated toward me, her motion slow and jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Her head tilted to the side with an awful wet crack, and a smile spread across her face, wide and sharp. "You should have stayed quiet," she said, though her voice wasn't hers. It came from all around us, layered, echoing, relentless. It doesn't like to be disturbed. What is this place? My voice was hoarse, barely audible over the roar in my head. Chloe didn't answer. She raised her arm, her fingers curling like claws, and I felt it, a pull. The air thickened, pressing against my chest, and my limbs grew heavy, like invisible hands were reaching inside me, wrapping around my ribs. I gasped, choking on nothing, my vision tunneling as the walls of the lodge seemed to stretch and twist, the symbols crawling across every surface now, alive. Matt's voice broke through the haze. "Alex." I felt him grab my arm, yanking me back so hard I thought my shoulder might dislocate. The pressure vanished, and I fell to the floor, gasping for air as the whispering rose to a crescendo. Matt was already pulling me toward the door, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "We have to move," he shouted. "Come on." I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak beneath me, and ran. Chloe's laughter followed us, a high, broken sound that rattled in my ears as we barreled into the hallway. The walls shook around us, the glow from the symbols leaking through the cracks like blood. The lodge was coming apart. I could feel it, something deep and angry waking beneath the floor, twisting its way through the house like roots. We hit the stairs hard, nearly tripping as the wood splintered and groaned under our weight. The front door was ahead, wide open now, as if inviting us into the freezing dark. But as we reached the bottom step, the floor shifted. It didn't creak. It breathed. I froze, my hand grabbing Matt's arm to steady myself as the ground rippled beneath us, the boards bending and splitting like skin being torn open. The floor cracked down the center, revealing something below. Darkness, deep and endless, swirling like ink. From within it, the whispers rose louder, and I could see shapes moving, arms, limbs, faces shifting just beyond the edge of sight. Matt yanked me toward the door. "Go!" We sprinted across the buckling floor, the darkness spreading beneath us like it was trying to swallow us whole. The cold outside hit me like a wave as we burst through the door, stumbling onto the frost-covered ground. I turned back just once, my breath catching in my throat. The lodge was alive. The windows flickered with light, symbols blazing across the walls inside, burning red and gold. The roof sagged and twisted, as though the house itself were being dragged downward, pulled into the dark thing that churned beneath it. Chloe stood on the porch, her form no longer fully human, her limbs stretched unnaturally, her face split by that impossibly wide grin. Her eyes were hollow voids, swallowing everything around them. "You can't run," she called, her voice carrying on the wind. "It's already inside you." I grabbed Matt's arm and pulled him toward the tree line. The forest was different now, impenetrable, the trees pressed together like a wall, but there was nowhere else to go. Behind us, the lodge groaned, the sound deep and terrible, like something ancient and angry screaming from beneath the earth. We pushed into the trees, branches clawing at my face, my arms, as we forced our way forward. The light from the lodge disappeared behind us, replaced by darkness so thick it felt alive. I couldn't hear Matt anymore. I couldn't hear anything. No wind, no footsteps, just the hammering of my pulse in my ears. Then, the whispering started again. It was quiet at first, threading through the trees like a cold wind. But it grew louder with each step, the words curling around me, seeping into my head. I stumbled, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. The forest was wrong. It stretched on forever, the trees identical, as though we were running in place. The whispering became words. "You woke it up." I froze, my chest heaving. The voice was clear now, low and close, like it was being spoken directly into my ear. I spun around, my flashlight shaking as I swept the beam through the trees. "Matt," I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The light caught something ahead, a figure standing perfectly still between the trees. I lifted the flashlight higher, my hands trembling. It wasn't Matt. It was Chloe, or what was left of her. She stood just beyond the edge of the light, her body twisted, her arms too long, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Her grin split her face like a wound, her black eyes locked on mine. "Alex," she whispered. The ground beneath me shifted. I looked down and saw it, the dark void, spreading through the frost, cracks splintering outward like spiderwebs. The whispering surrounded me. Chloe stepped closer, her form flickering like smoke. "It's your turn," she said, her voice layered and broken. The ground opened up, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The fall felt endless, a free fall into nothing, just the roar of blood in my ears, and the cold air whipping against my face. There was no bottom, no ground to brace for, just blackness. The darkness wrapped around me like wet cloth, suffocating and alive, seeping into my skin, into my bones. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I hit something hard, solid earth, the impact jarring through my ribs and knocking the wind from my lungs. I gasped, clawing at the frozen ground beneath me, my fingers sinking into soil that felt damp and warm. I blinked into the darkness, my eyes struggling to adjust. Shapes loomed around me, twisted and wrong. I was in a cavern, or maybe something older, a hollow space carved from stone and earth, the walls slick with something that gleamed in the faint red light coming from nowhere. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of metal and decay. I coughed, the taste of iron clinging to my tongue. Pushing myself to my knees, I looked around. My flashlight was gone, but there was light here, thin and pulsing, like it was breathing through the walls. The symbols were everywhere, carved deep into the stone, their edges jagged and unfinished, as though someone or something had gouged them into the earth with desperate hands. They pulsed faintly, like veins feeding into something larger. Behind me, the ground split open like a wound. I turned in time to see Matt, his body tumbling through the air, limp and lifeless, hit the ground with a sickening thud. "Matt!" I scrambled to him, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "Come on, wake up. Please, wake up." He groaned, his eyelids fluttering. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, relief flooding through me, but it was short-lived. Something moved. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the air, the pull deep in my chest, like a string had been tied around my ribs and yanked hard. I turned my head slowly, every nerve screaming at me not to look. But I did. The cavern stretched on endlessly, its ceiling hidden in shadow, its far walls bleeding into the dark. And from that darkness, they emerged. Shapes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They slithered and crawled along the ground, limbs dragging behind them like dead weight, their bodies shifting like smoke trapped in skin. Some were tall, their limbs grotesquely long and thin. Others were hunched, twisted like broken marionettes. Their faces were wrong, either blank voids or stretched and cracked like porcelain masks. They didn't move quickly. They didn't need to. They were spreading, filling the cavern, pressing in closer with every second. Matt coughed, his eyes snapping open. He stared past me, his face going pale. What is this?" "Get up," I whispered. My voice shook, but I didn't care. "We have to move." I grabbed his arm and pulled him to his feet. He swayed for a second, unsteady, but the sound, that sound, snapped him upright. A low hum filled the cavern, vibrating through my teeth and into my skull. The whispering followed, rising and falling in a broken rhythm. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, the red glow bleeding into the air itself. It was coming from beneath us, from the earth. I didn't want to look down, but I couldn't stop myself. The soil beneath my feet was splitting open, cracks snaking outward, and through them I saw it, something moving. It was massive, writhing just below the surface, its form shifting like liquid shadow, its edges pulsing like it was alive. Matt saw it too. "Oh my God," he breathed. A deep voice, not a voice, a vibration, shook the cavern. It wasn't words, but I understood it all the same. It was awake. The whispering became screams. The creatures surged forward as one, their movements frantic, desperate, like they were being pulled toward us by invisible threads. Matt grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. "The altar!" he shouted, pointing across the cavern. I turned, and there it was, a stone platform in the distance, covered in the same symbols that were carved into the walls. The light was brightest there, glowing like embers, and at the center sat a knife. It was old and jagged, its blade stained black, its surface carved with symbols that twisted as I stared at them. "It's a ritual," Matt said, his voice panicked. "We have to stop it. That knife, it's the key. We have to destroy it." The creatures were closer now, crawling over each other, their hollow faces turned toward us. I didn't stop to think. I ran. My legs felt like lead, the air thick as I forced myself forward. The ground shook beneath me, the cracks widening, the hum becoming a roar. The thing beneath us, whatever it was rising. Matt was right behind me, his breath ragged as we stumbled toward the altar. I reached it first, slamming my hands onto the cold stone, my fingers wrapping around the hilt of the knife. The moment I touched it, the world shifted. The cavern stretched and rippled, the symbols burning like fire, the creatures freezing mid-movement. The whispering turned into a scream, a single, deafening cry that shook the earth. My vision blurred, and I felt the pull again, dragging at me from every direction. "Destroy it!" Matt shouted. I raised the knife, my arms trembling. The blade was heavy, impossibly so, like it was pulling me downward. I slammed it against the altar, the stone splintering beneath the force. The knife cracked, the blade shattering into shards that scattered across the cavern floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the earth screamed. The ground collapsed beneath us, the stone splitting open, darkness pouring out in thick, swirling waves. The creatures wailed as they were pulled into it, their forms breaking apart like smoke in a storm. The thing beneath us roared, its voice shaking the walls, vibrating through my bones. I grabbed Matt as the altar crumbled, the ground falling away into nothing. "Run!" I screamed. We sprinted toward the edge of the cavern, the cracks chasing us, the earth falling away behind us like dominoes. I saw light, daylight, a thin sliver cutting through the darkness ahead. The exit. We dove for it, throwing ourselves through the opening just as the cavern collapsed behind us. The roar vanished, replaced by silence so sharp it made my ears ring. We were outside. The forest was still. The air was cold and sharp, but it was real. Solid ground beneath my hands, sunlight filtering through the trees. Matt was next to me, coughing, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "We did it," he whispered. "We stopped it." I looked back at the lodge. It was gone. The clearing was empty, nothing but broken earth and ash where the house had stood. But the forest still felt wrong, off. The silence wasn't normal. It was waiting, and deep in my chest I could still hear it, the faintest whisper, like a seed planted too deep to dig out. "It's not over." The road narrowed as we neared Raven's Hollow, the trees pressing closer on both sides until the sky disappeared entirely, swallowed by a tangle of skeletal branches. Our headlights barely pierced the fog, which curled like living things around the car. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed us whole. The GPS flickered, glitching before finally freezing on an empty screen. Dead signal, I muttered to myself, watching the pale glow of the screen fade completely. The air inside the car was too still, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, almost deliberate. Ethan kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence between us was heavy, tense. No music, no small talk. None of us wanted to admit it, but we could all feel it. Something wrong, something off. Claire sat in the back seat, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her phone as she tried, pointlessly, to get a signal. Josh, next to her, stared out the window, his shoulders stiff, like he was bracing for something to jump out of the trees. I envied the way he was staring into the dark, unafraid of what might stare back. Raven's Hollow didn't appear on any maps. Josh had found it first, some viral thread on an obscure forum, the kind of thing you stumble across when you're too deep into a midnight rabbit hole. America's Forgotten Towns, it was called. Lost places that shouldn't exist anymore, swallowed by time and circumstance. Places where people went missing. The post was filled with grainy photos of dilapidated buildings and half-buried roads, all blanketed in mist so thick it looked alive. But it was the stories that hooked us, whispers of strange sounds, townsfolk who'd vanished without a trace, and a church in the center that no one should ever enter. And yet here we were, our car rattling over broken asphalt, moving deeper into a place no one ever came back from. The first sign of the town was the archway. It rose out of the ground like a monument to something long dead. 2 crumbling pillars, carved with words too eroded to read. The car rolled under it, and I swear the temperature dropped. The fog thickened as we drove into the main road, swallowing the world beyond our headlights. Raven's Hollow was exactly as the pictures showed it, abandoned, silent, and wrong. The houses leaned together like conspirators, their roofs sagging under years of neglect. Shutters hung askew on rusted hinges, and broken windows stared back at us like empty eyes. The streets were covered in a thin film of dirt and moss, cracks snaking through the pavement like veins. Ethan pulled the car to a stop in the center of what might have been a square. A dried-out fountain sat there, its stone figures chipped and faceless. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp and jarring against the stillness. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel, and inhaled. The air smelled old, thick with damp earth and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. Claire's door slammed behind me and I turned. Her face was pale, and for once, she wasn't glued to her phone. She looked around the square, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "It's colder here," she said, though her words barely carried. She wasn't wrong. We stood there for a moment, 4 strangers in a place that didn't want us. The church was impossible to miss. It rose above the square like a jagged silhouette, its steeple twisted and black against the fog. The wood was gray and splintered, the windows dark. The double doors stood slightly ajar, inviting us inside. Something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had brought us here in the first place. I turned toward the others. "Let's take a look." No one protested. The steps leading up to the church were slick with moss, and the wood groaned under our weight as we climbed them. My hand hovered over the door, hesitating. It wasn't locked. I could tell that much from the way it hung unevenly in its frame. I pushed it open, and the hinges shrieked like they hadn't moved in decades. Inside, the air was worse, heavy and cloying, like breathing through a wet cloth. The pews were lined in crooked rows, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper, old hymnals, and splintered wood. The altar sat at the far end, a massive thing carved from black stone, its edges jagged and uneven. Behind it, the stained glass window was shattered, the empty frame casting strange shadows across the walls. Something crunched under my boot. I looked down and froze. It wasn't paper or wood. It was bones, small, delicate bones scattered across the floor like dried leaves. My throat tightened as I took a step back. Claire was standing near the pews, staring at something in her hands. It was a piece of cloth, tattered and dark with old stains. "This place is wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Josh's voice broke the silence. "Do you hear that?" I turned toward him, my skin prickling. "Hear what?" He didn't answer. He was staring down the center aisle, toward the altar. His head was tilted slightly, his brow furrowed. I strained my ears, but I didn't hear anything at first. Then it started. A faint whisper. It was so soft I thought it might have been the wind, but it grew louder, curling through the air like smoke. The words were broken, unintelligible, spoken in a voice that sounded like it had never belonged to a living thing. I turned toward the altar, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. And then I saw it. The shadow. It was just a flicker at first, a ripple in the air behind the altar, but then it moved. It unfolded, too tall and too thin, its edges shifting like it wasn't entirely solid. My breath caught in my throat as it turned toward us, and I felt it, its eyes. They weren't there, not really, but I could feel them locked on me, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. Josh stepped backward, his boot catching on a loose board. The sound shattered the silence, and the thing moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its form stretching unnaturally as it crossed the floor toward us. "Go!" I shouted, my voice breaking. We ran. I grabbed Claire's arm, dragging her toward the doors as the whispering rose to a deafening pitch, filling my head with static. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The pews blurred in my vision, the floor groaning beneath us like it was alive. The door was still open. We burst through it, stumbling down the steps, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The whispering stopped the second we crossed the threshold, leaving behind an awful ringing silence. Ethan was already by the car, yanking at the door handle. "Get in!" he shouted. I didn't hesitate. We scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut as Ethan turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. The church loomed in the rearview mirror, its doors still open, the shadows just beyond them, shifting like they were watching. The engine sputtered again. The headlights flickered, then went dark. And somewhere in the fog, the whispering started again. The engine refused to turn over, each sputter weaker than the last until there was nothing, just silence and the faint tick of cooling metal. Ethan swore under his breath, pounding his fist against the steering wheel, his face pale and slick with sweat. In the back seat, Claire pressed her hands over her ears, rocking slightly, her gaze locked on something I couldn't see. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was softer now, more distant, like it was curling through the fog and finding its way into the car. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, cold and sharp, threading through my thoughts like needles. The church loomed behind us, its blackened doors still open, as though waiting for us to come back. Shadows moved just beyond the threshold, shifting and stretching, as though something inside was pushing against the walls, trying to get out. "Get out," I said suddenly, my voice sounding hollow in the still air. Ethan turned to me, his brow furrowed. "What?" "Get out of the car." I couldn't explain it. I didn't even fully understand it. But something inside me, some primal instinct buried deep in my chest, was screaming that the car wasn't safe anymore. Whatever had slithered out of that church was still watching us, waiting for us to stay still, to let it close the distance. Ethan didn't argue. He opened his door, and the rest of us followed, stumbling out into the freezing fog. The cold sank into my skin immediately, sharp and punishing, but I didn't care. I felt like I could breathe again, as though the air inside the car had been slowly choking me. Josh was the last one out, slamming his door hard enough to make the sound echo through the empty streets. "Now what?" he muttered, his breath curling in front of him like smoke. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The fog pressed closer now, so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It swallowed the edges of the buildings, turning the town into a labyrinth of shifting shapes and shadows. I glanced back at the church, its outline blurred and distorted, and froze. The doors were closed. I knew they'd been open. I'd seen them wide and yawning in the rearview mirror. But now they were shut, and the faint whispering had stopped completely. The silence was worse. It was heavy, unnatural, like something holding its breath. Claire spoke first, her voice hoarse. "We need to find shelter." I turned to her. Her face was pale, her eyes too wide, darting back and forth like she expected something to lunge out of the fog. For the first time, I realized she was shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. "The houses," Ethan said, his voice low. "One of them has to be open. We'll figure this out in there." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than standing in the street. We moved together, our footsteps crunching softly against the frost-covered ground, the sound far too loud in the stillness. The fog curled around my ankles as we walked, thick and damp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving inside it, just beyond sight. The first house we tried was locked. So was the second. Both were crumbling, their porches sagging, their windows shattered and dark. The doors didn't even budge when Ethan shoved his shoulder against them. It was as though the town itself had closed us out, leaving us exposed in the cold. Then Claire stopped walking. "Over there," she whispered, pointing through the fog. I followed her finger and saw it, a house at the edge of the square, slightly larger than the others, its windows intact, its front door hanging open. It looked as though someone had left in a hurry, the wood splintered where the handle met the frame. We didn't question it. We ran. The inside of the house was freezing, the air heavy with dust and mildew, but it felt like a reprieve from the emptiness outside. The floor creaked under our weight as we moved through the narrow hallway, our breath fogging the air. The furniture was still here, old, rotting chairs, a sofa with stuffing spilling from its seams, but the house felt abandoned, like it had been left to rot for decades. Josh broke the silence. "This place is off." He wasn't wrong. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the faint outline of shapes I couldn't make out still visible beneath the grime. It felt wrong to be here, like we'd stepped into a place that didn't want us. I could almost hear it, some low vibration in the air, just beneath the edge of sound, a distant hum that made my teeth ache. Claire drifted toward a table in the corner of the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as though something were pulling her there. "Look at this," she murmured. We followed her gaze. On the table sat an old photograph, its edges curled and yellowed. The picture showed a family, mother, father, and 2 children, standing in front of the church. At first glance, it seemed normal, but when I looked closer, my stomach turned. Their faces were blurred, smudged out like someone had erased them with dirty fingers. Only their eyes remained, dark, empty holes that stared back at me. "Put it down," I said quickly, but Claire didn't move. She just kept staring at it, her fingers hovering over the frame. Then the whispering started again. It came from somewhere deep in the house, rising up through the floorboards like a tide. The same voices, layered and broken, their words unintelligible but full of malice. My chest tightened as the air grew colder, the hum beneath the sound rattling my bones. "Claire," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. "Put it down." She didn't listen. Her fingers curled around the edge of the frame, and the moment she touched it, the whispering turned into a roar. The floorboards beneath us shook, dust falling from the ceiling as the walls groaned, the sound vibrating through the house like a deep primal growl. Claire gasped, dropping the photo as though it had burned her, and stumbled back. From the hallway came a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward us. I turned toward the hall, my heart slamming against my ribs. The light was dim, but I could see it, a shape at the end of the corridor. It was tall and thin, its form distorted like a shadow stretched too far, its arms dragging along the ground as it moved. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it looking at me. "Go!" I shouted, shoving Josh toward the door. We stumbled into the street, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I turned back once, just long enough to see it, the thing standing in the doorway, watching us. Its head tilted slowly, its limbs twitching as though it were trying to hold itself together. The whispering followed us as we ran, curling through the fog, growing louder with every step. The streets twisted around us, the houses leaning closer, as though the town itself was closing in. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew we had to get away. And as we turned a corner, skidding to a stop, I realized the truth. We hadn't escaped. We were standing in front of the church again. The church stood there like it had been waiting for us, imposing and silent, its steeple lost in the fog. The black doors were closed again, as if whatever had slipped out earlier had gone back inside, content to lure us into its trap. The fog curled around the building, thicker here than anywhere else, like a living thing trying to seal us in. Claire grabbed my arm, her nails biting into my skin. Her breathing was fast and shallow, her eyes darting wildly to the edges of the square. How are we back here?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. My heart pounded as I scanned the empty streets, every shadow now a threat, every corner hiding something just beyond sight. It didn't make sense. We had run in a straight line. I knew we had. But Raven's Hollow didn't care about our sense of direction. It had twisted itself around us, pulling us back here like a spider herding flies into its web. Ethan swore, turning in a frantic circle, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "We didn't come this way. There's no way. This isn't." He stopped, shaking his head. "The place is playing with us." Josh didn't say anything. He just stared at the church, his face pale and damp with sweat. His lips moved slightly, as if he were mumbling something to himself. I took a step toward him, trying to see what he was staring at, and froze. The church doors were open again. A sliver of blackness stretched between them, darker than the fog, darker than night itself. And from that darkness, the whispering returned, low and layered, rising in pitch just enough to scrape at the edges of my mind. I felt it again, that strange pull in my chest, like invisible hands were reaching out, wrapping around my ribs and tugging me toward the door. "Don't look at it," I said, my voice hoarse. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy in my mouth. "Don't listen. Keep moving." But Josh wasn't listening. His head tilted slightly, his eyes unfocused, and he took a step toward the doors. "Josh!" I grabbed his shoulder and yanked him back. He stumbled, blinking like he'd just woken up from a dream. For a moment, his expression was blank, empty, but then his face twisted with fear. He staggered back, nearly falling. What was that?" he whispered. "You were staring at the door," I said, trying to steady my voice. "It's pulling us in. Don't let it." The whispering grew louder, curling around us like smoke. It came from the church, yes, but it was also everywhere, seeping through the fog, slipping under my skin, rattling against the edges of my mind. I couldn't understand the words, but I didn't need to. It wanted us inside. Ethan turned, his eyes wild. "We can't stay out here. We have to find somewhere else. Somewhere. He trailed off, and I knew what he was about to say. There was nowhere else. Every house was locked. Every road led back to this place. It didn't matter where we ran. Raven's Hollow wouldn't let us leave. Claire spoke, her voice hollow. What if we go in?" I turned to her, my stomach dropping. "What?" She wouldn't look at me. Her gaze stayed fixed on the ground, her hands trembling at her sides. "It's calling us. Maybe that's what it wants. Maybe if we go in, we can stop it. No? The word tore out of me before I could stop it. I grabbed her wrist, forcing her to look at me. You saw what happened in there. We're not going back inside. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Then what do? Just stand here until it gets us. The whispering rose to a fever pitch, and something thudded inside the church, something heavy and deliberate, like footsteps moving across the wooden floor. My chest tightened, and the hair on my arms stood on end. Run, I said. No one argued. We ran. The fog swallowed us whole as we sprinted down the empty street, our footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispering followed us, slithering through the air like a serpent, growing louder, sharper, until it was all I could hear. My lungs burned with every breath, the cold air slicing through my throat like glass. I didn't know where we were going, but I kept running, pulling Claire along with me, Ethan and Josh just ahead. And then the ground shifted beneath me. 1 second, I was running. The next, the pavement was gone, and I was falling, sliding down a steep incline of loose dirt and gravel. I hit the bottom hard. The wind knocked from my chest. I lay there, gasping, the world spinning. Alex. Ethan's voice sounded far away. I forced myself to sit up, wincing at the pain in my side. We'd fallen into some kind of ditch. No, not a ditch. A sinkhole, wide and deep. The earth split open like a wound. Above us, the fog pressed close to the edges, turning the sky into a swirling gray ceiling. Claire landed next to me with a soft thud, groaning as she pushed herself up. What is this? Ethan and Josh climbed down carefully, their faces pale in the dim light. Ethan looked around, his brow furrowed. It's a tunnel. He was right. The sinkhole had opened up into something else, an entrance to a tunnel carved into the earth, its walls damp and rough, leading downward into blackness. The air that drifted up from it was foul, thick with rot and something else. Something old, something alive. Josh swallowed hard, his voice shaking. We're not seriously going in there, are we? I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to claw my way out of this hole and run. But where would we go? The church, the town, the fog, it was all connected. All of it was alive, and it wouldn't let us go until it was done with us. We don't have a choice, I said. It's this or... I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. The whispering had returned, drifting down from above, slipping through the cracks in the earth. And somewhere beyond it, faint and distant, I heard something else. Laughter. Not human laughter. Not really. It was wet and broken, like something trying to mimic the sound, but not quite understanding how. It sent a spike of ice through my veins. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from his pack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, barely reaching more than a few feet ahead. Let's move, he said quietly. We stepped into the tunnel. The walls closed in quickly, pressing tight around us. The air was cold and wet, and the sound of our breathing echoed back at us, too loud. The ground sloped downward, leading us deeper into the earth, and the farther we went, the worse the smell became. It was overwhelming now, thick, suffocating, like rotting meat and stagnant water. The whispering followed us, louder with every step, until it wasn't whispering at all. It was chanting, layered and broken, rising and falling like a heartbeat. And that's when I realized the tunnel wasn't empty. There were shapes in the dark, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Figures that moved silently along the walls, their limbs too long, their bodies flickering like shadows that couldn't decide whether or not to exist. We weren't alone. And whatever was waiting at the end of the tunnel, it was hungry. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, the beam from Ethan's flashlight barely piercing the thick, oily darkness. Our footsteps echoed unnaturally against the damp earth, The sound distorted as though the tunnel itself were swallowing it. The air was wet and heavy, pressing against my skin like a second layer. With every step, the chanting grew louder, an unholy choir reverberating through the walls, each voice layered and broken, speaking in a language that scraped against my mind. Ethan led the way, his shoulders tight and rigid, his hand gripping the flashlight so hard I thought it might snap. Claire followed just behind him, her breathing sharp and uneven, like she was choking on the same air that was clogging my lungs. Josh stumbled next to me, his head twitching toward every shadow that flickered along the walls. The figures were still there, skittering on the edges of the light, their shapes shifting, limbs flickering in and out of focus. We weren't supposed to be here. The thought repeated in my head like a mantra, a drum beat pounding in time with my footsteps. We weren't supposed to be here. This wasn't meant for us. The tunnel sloped downward again, and I felt the pull. It was subtle at first, like something tugging at the base of my spine, but it grew stronger with each step, like the earth itself was dragging us deeper. I clenched my fists, trying to block it out, but it was everywhere. The chanting was inside me now, vibrating through my ribs, rattling against the hollow space behind my eyes. "Do you feel that?" Claire's voice broke the silence, trembling as it echoed off the walls. Ethan didn't answer. He just kept walking, his pace quickening as though he could outrun whatever was waiting at the end of this nightmare. And then I smelled it. The air shifted suddenly, carrying a new stench that hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was sharp and metallic, the kind of smell that reminded me of copper pennies and open wounds. Blood. Thick, fresh blood. I gagged, my hand flying to my mouth, but it didn't help. The scent was everywhere, clinging to my skin, to the walls, to the very air itself. Ahead of us, the tunnel widened abruptly, opening into a cavern that swallowed the light whole. Ethan stopped at the threshold, his flashlight shaking as he aimed it forward. "Jesus," he whispered. I stepped up beside him and froze. The cavern stretched impossibly large, its ceiling disappearing into shadow, its walls alive with carvings, symbols that pulsed with faint red light, burning like fresh scars. The floor was uneven, littered with jagged stones and bones, some small, others far too large to belong to animals. But it was the center of the cavern that made my breath stop. A circle had been carved into the ground, its grooves deep and wet, the light pooling around it like blood. At the center of the circle stood an altar, a jagged slab of black stone, slick with something that gleamed in the dim light. Chains were bolted to its sides, trailing down into the dirt like roots. And standing just beyond the altar were the figures. There were dozens of them, tall, skeletal shapes with limbs too long, and heads that tilted at impossible angles. Their skin was stretched thin and black, like old leather wrapped around bones. Some of them stood still, their hollow faces turned toward us, while others twitched and shuddered, their limbs jerking as though they were trying to break free of something we couldn't see. Josh stumbled backward, his voice a hoarse whisper. What is this place?" Ethan didn't move. His flashlight trembled in his hands, the beam dancing across the cavern, and the figures followed it. Their heads turned in unison, the movement sharp and unnatural, their empty faces locked onto the light. Claire whimpered behind me. "We shouldn't be here. We have to leave." I wanted to listen to her. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my gaze fixed on the altar, on the shapes that surrounded it. One of the figures moved. It stepped forward, its limbs stretching and snapping into place with a sickening crack. Its head tilted to one side, its hollow face fixed on us. For the first time I heard it, not the chanting, but something else. It was breathing. The sound was deep and ragged, like air being sucked through lungs that hadn't worked in centuries. It grew louder as the figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and wrong, its arms dragging along the ground as it moved. And then it spoke. The words spilled from its mouth, in a voice that didn't belong in this world, low and broken, vibrating through my bones, the sound scraping against my mind. I couldn't understand the language, but I knew what it meant. You don't belong here. The pull in my chest grew stronger. My feet felt heavy, like they were being dragged forward against my will. I clenched my fists, my nails biting into my palms as I fought to hold my ground. Ethan was yelling something. I couldn't hear him over the roar in my head. Claire screamed. The figure lunged. It moved too quickly, closing the distance in an instant, its form stretching and flickering as though it weren't fully solid. Ethan's flashlight fell from his hand, clattering against the stone floor, its beam spinning wildly across the cavern. The moment the light hit the figure, it froze, its limbs locking in place as though the beam had pinned it down. Ethan grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the tunnel. Run! We ran, unwind. The cavern shook around us, the chanting rising to a deafening crescendo, the voices screaming from the walls, the ceiling, the ground beneath our feet. The figures followed. I could hear them moving behind us, their footsteps dragging and thudding as they closed the distance. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My lungs burned as I forced my legs to move faster, my hands scrabbling against the walls to keep myself upright. The tunnel twisted and stretched, the air growing colder and thicker with every step. I could feel them behind me, close enough to touch, close enough to pull me back into the dark. Claire's sobs echoed ahead of me, Ethan's footsteps pounding against the dirt. And then I saw it, light. A faint glow ahead, spilling through the cracks in the tunnel walls. I pushed harder, my body screaming in protest, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might burst. The figures were right behind me now, their whispers blending into a roar, their breath hot against the back of my neck. We burst out of the tunnel in a tangle of limbs, collapsing onto frozen ground. The light of Ethan's flashlight was gone, replaced by a pale gray glow that hung heavy over the clearing. We were back in Raven's Hollow. The church loomed ahead, its doors wide open, and I realized the truth. We hadn't escaped. We had come full circle. The cold ground bit into my palms as I pushed myself upright, gasping for breath. My legs were trembling, my lungs burning as though I'd been running for miles. Around us, Raven's Hollow sat in perfect stillness, the fog pressing in from all sides, clinging to the broken rooftops and crumbling streets. The church loomed ahead, its dark silhouette watching us, its doors wide open, like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Ethan was already on his feet, pacing back and forth, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. "This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "We ran for miles. I saw light. We got out. How the hell are we back here?" Claire curled into herself nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She rocked slightly, whispering something over and over under her breath. I couldn't make out the words, but her voice was raw, trembling, as though she were trying to convince herself that this wasn't real. I turned to Josh. He was standing still, his gaze fixed on the church. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, his expression blank, empty. He hadn't moved since we'd stumbled out of the tunnel. His eyes were wide and unblinking, locked on the doors, like he could see something the rest of us couldn't. "Josh." I said his name softly, trying to pull him out of it, but he didn't react. I stepped closer, shaking his shoulder. "Josh." His head snapped toward me, his movements jerky, unnatural. For a moment, his eyes didn't look like his own, dark and hollow, like something else was staring back at me. Then he blinked, and the emptiness was gone, replaced by terror. "They're still here," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I saw them, in the tunnel. They're watching us." The fog seemed to shift as he spoke, curling tighter around us, its edges darker now, thicker. I turned toward the church again, my skin prickling. The whispering was faint now, threading through the air like a breeze, but I could still hear it, Those same layered voices, rising and falling, chanting words that didn't belong in any language I knew. Ethan stopped pacing. "We have to stop this," he said, his voice ragged. "Whatever in that church, whatever's down there, we have to end it." Claire looked up sharply, her eyes glassy and red. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're not going back in there." Ethan ignored her, turning to me. "You saw it. That thing, the altar, the symbols, that's where it started. If we destroy it, maybe we can..." "Can what?" I snapped, cutting him off. My voice was louder than I meant it to be, echoing through the empty square. "End this? Fix it? We don't even know what this is, Ethan. What if going back just makes it worse?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the church. "Then what do you suggest? We sit here and wait for them to come get us?" I didn't have an answer. I looked at the church again, its doors still hanging open, the darkness inside stretching endlessly beyond the threshold. My gut twisted as I remembered the altar, the jagged stone slick with something dark, the carvings that seemed to pulse like veins, alive and waiting. Whatever was in there, whatever we disturbed, it wanted us to come back. And it was waiting. Josh spoke suddenly, his voice faint. "It's the only way." We all turned to look at him. He was still staring at the church, his expression blank again, as though he were listening to something just beyond our hearing. "It's calling us," he said softly. "It won't stop until we finish it." Claire shook her head violently, her voice rising. "No, don't you get it? That's what it wants. It wants us to go back so it can take us, one by one. We can't..." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Ethan looked at me again, his expression pleading. "Alex, you know I'm right. If we don't stop this now, it's going to kill us anyway." I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But Ethan was right. We couldn't escape. No matter where we went, the church was waiting. The whispering, the figures in the shadows, the pull, it was all connected, and the longer we waited, the closer it got. "Fine," I said finally, my voice shaking. "But if we're doing this, we do it together. No one splits up. No one goes off alone. Got it?" Ethan nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. Josh didn't react, his gaze still fixed on the church. Claire didn't move. I crouched next to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Claire," I said softly, "I know you're scared. I am too, but we have to finish this. We don't have a choice." She didn't look up, but after a long moment, she nodded. We turned toward the church. The whispering grew louder as we approached, wrapping around us like invisible hands, pulling us closer with every step. The doors loomed ahead, taller now, like the building itself had grown, stretching upward into the fog. I forced myself to keep moving, even as my legs felt like lead, the weight of the air pressing against my chest. Ethan stepped through the doorway first, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dark. Josh followed, his movements stiff and robotic, like he was being pulled by strings. Claire clung to my arm, her fingers digging into my skin as we crossed the threshold together. Inside, the church was worse than I remembered. The pews were warped and splintered, the carvings on the walls glowing faintly red, casting pulsing shadows that seemed to crawl across the floor. The altar stood at the far end, surrounded by dark stains that soaked into the wood. The air was heavy with the smell of rot, and something else, something sharp and metallic, like the earth itself was bleeding. And the whispering was everywhere. It echoed from the walls, the floor, the air, growing louder with every step we took toward the altar. My head throbbed, the sound vibrating through my skull, making it hard to think. The symbols on the altar pulsed brighter now, the grooves slick with something that moved, thick and dark, like liquid shadow. Josh moved first, stepping toward the altar as though in a trance. "It's here," he whispered. Ethan grabbed his arm, yanking him back. Snap out of it. We need to destroy it, now. I moved forward, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the whispering anymore. The air around the altar was thicker, heavy with heat that shouldn't have been there. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the stone. The whispering stopped. For one horrifying moment, there was nothing but silence. And then the ground split open. The altar cracked down the center, a deep fissure spreading outward like veins through the floor. The glow from the symbols turned blinding, spilling out in waves of red light as the entire church began to shake. From the crack in the earth came a sound, a low guttural roar that shook me to my core. And then they came. Figures rose from the ground, their bodies shifting and flickering like smoke, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they pulled themselves free. Their faces were empty, hollow voids that seemed to swallow the light, and their whispers returned, louder now, clearer, echoing through the church like a storm. I stumbled back, grabbing Claire as she screamed. Ethan was yelling something, his voice lost in the roar, as the figures closed in, their movements jerky and inhuman. The church was collapsing around us, the walls splitting, the ceiling crumbling as the fissure widened. And in the center of it all, the altar pulsed, alive, waiting. The ground beneath the altar cracked open like a splitting wound, darkness pouring out in thick, pulsing waves. The roar coming from below was alive, vibrating through the walls, the floor, my bones. I couldn't breathe. The air around us had changed, thick with heat, heavy like something was pressing down from above and dragging us toward the earth, all at once. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the splintering floorboards, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figures were rising. They crawled out of the fissure, pulling themselves free of the dark, their limbs stretching and jerking, as though their bones weren't meant to hold them up. They were wrong. Twisted silhouettes with arms too long, torsos too thin, and heads that lolled to one side as they moved. Their faces were empty voids, hollow spaces where features should have been, and yet I could feel them looking at me. The whispering returned. It wasn't coming from the fissure anymore. It was them. Their mouths stretched open, black pits that pulled at the air, and the words spilled out, layered and broken, vibrating with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The voices were endless, curling around me like smoke, seeping into my head until it felt like they were inside my skull. Ethan was shouting something, his voice hoarse, but I couldn't hear him. Claire screamed behind me, the sound raw and panicked as one of the figures moved toward her, its steps jerky and deliberate, like it was learning how to walk. I lunged for her, grabbing her wrist, pulling her back just as the thing's outstretched arms swept the air where she'd been. Its fingers were wrong, long and splintered, like sharpened branches, dragging through the floorboards as it turned its hollow face toward us. "Move!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the roar. Ethan grabbed Josh, who stood frozen at the edge of the fissure, staring into it like it was calling him home. The symbols carved into the altar and walls pulsed brighter now, bleeding red light that cast jagged shadows across the church. The whole place shook, the ceiling splitting open, beams crashing to the ground in clouds of dust. "We have to destroy it!" Ethan's voice finally cut through. He pointed toward the altar, which stood at the center of the chaos, glowing brighter with every second. My stomach twisted. The altar, the jagged slab of black stone slick with dark stains, was alive. I could see it now, the way the cracks in its surface pulsed like veins, the dark liquid dripping down its sides pooling into the growing fissure below. Josh turned to me, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "It's feeding," he whispered. "It's been feeding this whole time." "Then we end it," Ethan roared. Claire's grip on my arm was tight enough to bruise as we sprinted toward the altar, dodging splintered wood and debris. The figures moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, dragging themselves between the pews, their hollow faces turned toward us, their whispers rising with every step. One of them lunged, its arm sweeping out like a blade, but Ethan ducked beneath it, grabbing a broken beam from the floor and swinging it hard. The beam splintered on impact, sending the figure sprawling to the ground. It didn't stay down. Its limbs twisted, contorting as it pulled itself upright again, its face locked on Ethan. "Faster!" I screamed. We reached the altar. Up close, the heat pouring off it was unbearable, like standing next to an open furnace. My skin prickled, and my head pounded, the pull in my chest growing stronger, like something inside me was being yanked toward the stone. The red light spilling from the cracks was blinding now, flickering in waves as though the altar itself was breathing. Ethan grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground and swung it overhead, bringing it down on the altar with everything he had. The sound echoed through the church, a sharp crack that split the air, but the altar held. The light flared brighter, the whispering rising into a scream. "It's not enough," Ethan shouted. My gaze darted around the church, desperate for something, anything that could help. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the fissure, a shape jutted out of the dark liquid pooling beneath the altar. It was a knife, long and ancient, its blade blackened and jagged, covered in symbols that pulsed faintly in the red light. "It's part of the altar," I shouted. "The knife. It's connected." Ethan turned, his eyes locking onto the blade. "Go." He grabbed the pipe again, swinging it at one of the figures as it lunged for him. I didn't wait. I ran for the knife, the ground cracking and shifting beneath my feet as the fissure widened, pulling the earth apart. The whispering was deafening now, the voices overlapping, screaming through my head. My vision blurred, but I kept moving, sliding to my knees at the edge of the dark pool. The knife was there, half submerged in the thick liquid. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive, waiting. My stomach twisted as I reached for it, the air around it freezing cold, like the void itself had bled into this place. My fingers closed around the hilt. The moment I touched it, the world stopped. The church went silent, the roar and whispers cutting off like a severed wire. I couldn't move. The knife burned against my skin, freezing cold and searing hot all at once. The symbols carved into the blade glowing brighter until they burned red into my vision. A voice, not one of the whispers, but something deeper, older, spoke directly into my mind. "You will not break the seal." The ground shook violently, the fissure splitting wider. I could feel the dark liquid rising, reaching for me, the figures closing in, their whispers returning louder than before. I gripped the knife harder, pulling it free with a scream. The moment the blade left the liquid, the altar exploded. A shock wave ripped through the church, throwing me backward, the knife still clutched in my hand. The red light flared brighter than ever, then blinked out completely. The figures froze, their limbs locking in place as though they were puppets whose strings had been cut. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the ground beneath the altar collapsed, a deafening roar splitting the air as the fissure widened, pulling the altar, the figures, and the entire floor into the void below. I scrambled back, grabbing Claire as she screamed, the two of us stumbling toward the doorway. Ethan and Josh were already there, shouting for us to move. We ran. The church came down behind us, beams snapping like twigs, stone and wood collapsing into the growing pit. The roar was deafening, the earth itself trembling beneath our feet. We burst through the doors into the freezing air, the ground splitting behind us, the church sinking into the void like a dying animal. I turned back once, just in time to see it, the darkness rising up like a tidal wave, swallowing the church, the altar, and the glowing symbols in one final suffocating burst. Then it was gone. The church was no more. The ground where it had stood was cracked and barren, the fissure sealed, as though it had never been there. The air was still, the fog thinning, the whispering, finally, gone. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. Josh stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the church had been. Claire clung to me, her hands trembling. For the first time since we arrived in Raven's Hollow, there was silence. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something was watching us, just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the next mistake. The silence after the collapse was deafening. The ground where the church once stood was a crater, blackened, cracked earth, stretching like a scar across the town square. The air hung heavy, still thick with the scent of smoke and something metallic, like blood that had been left to dry. My chest ached with every breath, each one a reminder that I was still here, still alive, though I didn't know how or why. Ethan sat on the ground, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his shoulders heaving as he stared at the crater in front of us. Claire clung to me, her hands trembling against my arm, her gaze fixed on the blackened earth like she expected something to crawl back out of it. Josh stood off to the side, unmoving, his eyes hollow as he stared into nothing. None of us spoke. None of us moved. It felt like any sound, any motion, might wake whatever was still buried deep in that void. The fog had thinned around us now, peeling back like curtains after a show, revealing the decaying skeleton of Raven's Hollow in its entirety. But something was wrong. The houses leaned further into themselves, their walls sagging like they'd been left to rot for centuries in just a few hours. The streets cracked and crumbled, pieces of pavement missing, swallowed by the earth below. It was like the town had died, finally collapsing under the weight of whatever had kept it alive this long. "We did it," Ethan whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice shook, his hands gripping his knees tightly. "It's over. We destroyed it." Claire flinched at his words. "Is it?" Her voice was thin, barely audible. She turned toward me, her eyes wide, filled with something between fear and desperation. "Do you feel that? It's still here." I didn't want to admit it, but I did. Something about the air felt wrong, like a weight that refused to lift. It was quieter now, yes, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet you hear just before a storm, when the wind dies and the world holds its breath. "We need to get out here," I said, forcing my voice to steady, though it sounded hollow even to me. "The car, if the fog's gone, maybe we can—" A noise stopped me cold. It was faint, so soft I might have missed it if not for the sudden stillness. A whisper, just a single word, so low it seemed to rise from the cracks in the earth itself, curling through the air like smoke. I couldn't understand it, but I felt it. My chest tightened as the word echoed in my mind, familiar and foreign all at once. Josh turned slowly, his movements stiff, his face, pale and slack, tilted upward toward the sky. "It's not gone," he said flatly. I followed his gaze. My heart stopped. The sky above Raven's Hollow had darkened. The gray overcast had deepened into something far worse, an endless, swirling black that churned like smoke. It didn't look like clouds. It looked like void, spreading outward, rippling in unnatural patterns as though it were alive. Something was wrong with the sun, too. I couldn't see it, but the light was fading, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I could see my breath again, curling in front of me as I exhaled. And then I saw them. Shapes moved through the black sky, silhouetted against the churning void. Figures, tall and thin, their limbs elongated, their movements jerky like broken puppets. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They drifted silently above the ruins of the town, their hollow faces turned toward us, watching, waiting. Claire let out a choked sob, stumbling back. No, we destroyed it. We stopped it." Ethan staggered to his feet, his hands shaking. "We have to go, now." None of us argued. We ran. The streets were worse now, broken apart like the earth itself was rejecting us. We stumbled over cracks and shattered pavement, the wind rising around us, carrying the sound of whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping, crawling through the air like insects. The figures in the sky followed us, drifting soundlessly above the town, their movements impossibly smooth. The car sat where we'd left it in the square, its windows fogged and covered in a thin layer of frost. Ethan reached it first, yanking the door open and throwing himself behind the wheel. I pulled Claire forward, shoving her into the back seat before climbing in beside her. Josh slid in last, his head darting upward to watch the shapes overhead. "Start the car!" I screamed. Ethan jammed the keys into the ignition, his hands trembling so hard they barely turned. The engine sputtered, choking on itself. "Come on, come on, come on!" The figures were getting closer. They were lower now, their movements more deliberate as they circled above us, drifting like predators. The whispering was louder, pressing against my skull, spilling over into my thoughts. I felt them everywhere, inside the car, in the air, under my skin. The engine roared to life. Ethan floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, tires skidding on the cracked pavement. The sound was deafening as the engine screamed, the car jolting and bouncing as we tore through the center of town. I looked out the window as we passed the ruins, the shapes in the sky following us like shadows. The houses leaned toward us, their broken frames groaning, as if the town itself was trying to pull us back. Claire sobbed next to me, her hands pressed over her ears, her body rocking back and forth. "Make it stop," she whispered. "Make it stop." The edge of the town appeared ahead, a narrow road winding out of Raven's Hollow, the forest beyond now visible as the fog had begun to clear. For a second, I dared to believe we might make it. And then the road cracked. The earth split open in front of us, jagged fissures spreading outward like veins, swallowing the pavement as though the ground itself was rejecting our escape. Ethan swerved, screaming as the car skidded sideways. The front tires hit loose gravel, and for a moment I felt the world tilt. The car slammed into the ditch, throwing us forward as the windshield shattered. My head hit something hard, and the world blurred into darkness. When I opened my eyes, the world was silent again. My body ached, every nerve screaming as I forced myself upright. The car was ruined, steam hissing from the engine. The others were slumped around me, groaning, blood streaking their faces. I looked up. The figures were there. They stood now, not drifting, not floating, just standing in a perfect circle around us, their hollow faces turned downward, staring. Their whispers started again, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the air, through the earth, through me. Ethan stirred, his voice ragged. "Alex!" I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on the horizon. Beyond the figures, beyond the circle, the sky was cracking. The blackness split apart, rippling outward like glass under pressure, and from those cracks, I saw it, something deeper, something I couldn't describe. It was awake. The figures stepped closer, their whispers rising as the cracks spread across the sky, as though the world itself was breaking. Claire let out a sound, part scream, part sob, as she clutched at her head, her body shaking violently. Ethan grabbed my arm, his eyes wild. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. There was no escape. Not this time. The darkness reached us, swallowing the last of the light, pulling us into a place where time and sound and thought no longer existed. And as the whispers consumed us, I realized the truth. Raven's Hollow had never been a place. It was a door.
The sun was just a sliver on the horizon when we drove into Ashen Creek. The desert swallowed the road behind us, endless and barren, a flat expanse of cracked earth and lifeless brush stretching into the distance. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten by time, dead long before we arrived. Dust swirled across the road, rising in thin streams like ghosts trying to escape the earth. I hadn't spoken in hours. None of us had. The closer we got to the town, the heavier the air became, as if something unseen was pushing against us. The sign at the edge of the town was barely legible. Its wood splintered, the paint peeled away. Ashen Creek. Population 0.I. Someone had scrawled the 0 in thick, jagged lines, as though they wanted to make sure no one missed it. Beyond the sign, the town rose out of the earth like a mirage. Low buildings slouched against one another, their facades cracked and faded from years under the brutal desert sun. Windows stared back at us, dark and empty, their glass shattered or missing altogether. The silence here was so deep it pressed against my ears, broken only by the soft hum of the engine. We parked in what might have once been the town square, though now it was nothing but dust and ruin. A dried-up fountain sat in the center, its stone figures eroded into faceless shapes. The air smelled like rusted iron and old wood, sharp and wrong, like something decaying just out of sight. I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching against gravel and bone-dry earth. The sound seemed too loud. I glanced at the others. Sarah and Elias were unloading their gear from the back, and Leah stood near the edge of the square, staring down a long, empty street that disappeared into a haze of heat and dust. The town felt wrong. I couldn't put it into words, but there was something about the place that made my skin prickle. It wasn't just the abandonment or the rot. It was the stillness, the kind of quiet that wasn't natural, as though everything in the world had stopped here and refused to start again. "This place is dead," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself or the others. Leah's voice came from somewhere to my left. "No, it's waiting." I turned to look at her. She hadn't moved, her body still as stone, her gaze locked on the horizon where the buildings ended and the desert swallowed everything. Her face was pale, her eyes narrowed slightly, like she could see something I couldn't. A shiver crawled up my spine despite the heat. Leah had always been the quiet one, stoic, logical. But something about the way she said that made my throat dry out. Elias called us back, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. He'd found the nexus point, as he called it, a tear in the ground near the fountain, just as his readings had suggested. I walked over to where he stood, crouching beside a fissure in the earth. It stretched for yards in either direction, jagged and raw, the soil around it blackened as though it had been scorched. I leaned closer, peering into the darkness below. The crack was deeper than it looked. From this angle, it seemed endless, the shadows devouring the light of the setting sun. Elias knelt beside me, his handheld scanner beeping softly as he waved it over the fissure. "The readings are off the charts," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Excitement, maybe, or fear. "Seismic activity this high shouldn't be possible without a fault line. But there's something moving down there. Do you hear it?" I froze, holding my breath. At first, I heard nothing, just the sound of the wind, thin and weak as it whistled through the abandoned buildings. Then I heard it, a faint thrum, deep and rhythmic, like something breathing far below us. My heart skipped a beat, and I pulled back instinctively, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "It's probably just shifting sediment," Elias said, though his voice wavered. "The earth settling after the last quake." But I knew he was wrong. It didn't sound like sediment. It sounded alive. The sun was gone now, replaced by a gray, lifeless dusk that bled over the town. Shadows pooled at the edges of the square, crawling up the sides of the buildings like ink. Leah stood near one of the structures, staring at something on the ground. I crossed the square to join her, my footsteps strangely muffled, the air growing colder. She didn't look up when I approached. "Leah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She pointed. I followed her finger and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Scattered across the ground were bones, hundreds of them. They were small, brittle, some cracked in half, others almost perfectly intact. At first I thought they might have been animal remains, but as I knelt and picked one up, I realized the truth. It was a human finger bone, bleached white and cold to the touch. My breath caught, and I dropped it immediately, wiping my hands on my jeans as though I could scrub away the feeling. Where did these come from? I muttered, mostly to myself. Leah didn't answer. She was staring past me now, her face pale, her eyes wide. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my chest. At the edge of the square, just beyond the buildings where the desert stretched into nothingness, something moved. It was just a flicker at first, a ripple of darkness, like heat distortion. But then it stepped closer, and I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated, its arms hanging too low, its fingers dragging through the dust. Its face was hidden, nothing but shadow where features should have been. But I could feel it watching me, staring through the hollow void where its eyes should have been. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, still as death. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my ears. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. No. The others were gathering around, their eyes darting between me and the thing in the shadows. But when we turned back to the fissure, it was different. The ground had split wider, deeper, and the sound, the breathing, was louder now, rising from below, a heavy guttural rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Then, the whispering started. It came from everywhere. From the fissure, from the shadows, from the wind itself. The voices layered over each other, too many to count, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but still felt deep in my chest. The figure at the edge of the square began to move, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. Sarah screamed. The ground shook violently, the fissure cracking wider as the earth beneath us gave way. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us was the figure, standing perfectly still, its hollow face staring back at me. And then we fell. The fall had knocked the breath out of me, leaving only pain and ringing silence in its wake. Dust settled slowly, drifting through the air like ash as I pushed myself upright, wincing at the sting in my ribs. My flashlight flickered weakly in the dirt nearby, its beam trembling in the heavy darkness. For a long moment I sat still, trying to piece together what had just happened. The ground had given way beneath us, opening like a trapdoor into something far older and far darker than I could imagine. Daniel, where are you?" Leah's voice was faint, tight with panic, but it cut through the haze clouding my mind. I grabbed the flashlight, its light shaking as I turned toward the sound. She was a few feet away, crouched low, her face pale in the glow of her own light. Her hands trembled as she scanned the cavern around us. The walls stretched impossibly high into shadow, their surfaces rough and uneven. My flashlight caught faint patterns in the stone, lines and shapes that seemed too deliberate to be natural. "I'm here," I managed to croak, coughing dust from my lungs. "Where are the others?" "Here," came another voice, followed by the sound of shifting rubble. Sarah appeared from the gloom, brushing dirt from her clothes and clutching at a cut on her forehead. Elias was right behind her, his face pale and drawn. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice tight, though he already knew the answer. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned my flashlight downward, sweeping the beam over the cavern floor. It was uneven and littered with debris, the air cold and damp, carrying a faint scent that made the back of my throat tighten, like metal left out in the rain. But it wasn't just dirt and stone beneath us. Scattered across the ground, half buried in the dust, were shapes, fragments of things that didn't belong. My light froze on something small and pale. I didn't want to believe it, but as I knelt to look closer, the truth was undeniable. It was a bone. The others saw it too. Leah let out a sharp breath, her flashlight darting over the ground to reveal more. Ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all broken and scattered like discarded refuse. Some were small, fragile, others far too large. Sarah swore under her breath, stumbling back. This isn't right," Elias whispered. He was staring at the cavern walls now, his beam catching more of the strange patterns carved into the stone. "Do you see this? These aren't just cracks. These are markings." I followed his gaze. The carvings stretched across every surface. Lines and grooves etched deep into the rock, intersecting to form patterns that pulsed faintly under the flashlight's glare. I felt sick looking at them, like my mind couldn't fully grasp their design. They weren't words, not exactly, but they meant something. Something I didn't want to understand. And then, I heard it. A faint sound rising from somewhere deep within the cavern. Low and rhythmic. Like the beat of a distant drum, or a pulse from beneath the earth. It started small, barely noticeable. But as I focused, it seemed to vibrate through the ground, rattling the air, the rock, and the space inside my chest. "Do you hear that?" Leah's voice trembled. The others nodded, their faces pale and strained. Elias stepped forward, his flashlight fixed on a narrow opening in the cavern wall. A tunnel carved into the rock, its entrance framed by even more of the strange symbols. The sound was coming from there, growing louder with every second, beckoning us closer. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said sharply, glancing back the way we came. "Find another way up. That tunnel is a death trap." "There's no way back," Elias replied, his voice quiet but firm. He pointed at the ceiling above us, where jagged cracks stretched across the stone like veins. The ground collapsed behind us. "The only way out is forward." The whispering began softly, curling through the air like mist. At first I thought it was the wind, filtering through cracks in the stone, but it was too deliberate. The voices were layered, soft and overlapping. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in tones that made my skin crawl. I felt it inside me, like fingers trailing along my spine, and I could tell the others felt it too. "We're not alone down here," Leah whispered. No one argued. Elias stepped toward the tunnel, the beam of his flashlight barely piercing the heavy dark. I hesitated, my body screaming at me to turn back, to find some other way. But instinct told me there was nothing behind us anymore, only the void, and whatever had been waiting in it. We followed him. The tunnel closed around us almost immediately, the walls pressing tight, the air colder with every step. The whispering grew louder, bouncing off the stone, the rhythm of the pulse beneath us quickening. I felt like I was moving deeper into something living, something breathing. My flashlight flickered, and my heart jumped. For a second, I thought I saw something move, a shadow pulling itself along the wall, just beyond the light's reach. "Keep going," Elias called back, though his voice was quieter now, the confidence in it faltering. We pressed on. The tunnel twisted and turned, the carvings growing more elaborate, glowing faintly as though lit from within. I tried not to look at them. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to shift, their shapes twisting like they were alive, whispering things just beyond my hearing. The tunnel opened suddenly into a massive chamber. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over the space. The ceiling disappeared into blackness, and the walls were covered, every inch, with symbols carved into the stone. At the center of the room stood an altar. It was massive and jagged, its surface slick with something dark that pooled in grooves leading outward like veins. The pulse was deafening here, vibrating through the air, the ground, my chest. Leah's flashlight trembled in her hand as she whispered, "This isn't natural. This isn't real." But it was. The whispering turned into a roar, louder, clearer, as something shifted in the shadows beyond the altar. I froze, the beam of my light catching movement. A figure, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its body barely solid, as it folded itself forward. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, pulling itself across the ground with sharp, jerking motions. Elias stumbled back, his voice catching in his throat. What is that?" It lifted its head. There was no face, just darkness, deep and endless. But I felt it looking at me. A cold, sharp pull sank into my chest, dragging me forward as the whispering turned into words I still couldn't understand. My legs locked, my breath shallow, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. "Run!" I choked out. The thing moved, faster than it had any right to, and the room exploded into chaos. The chamber erupted into chaos as the figure lunged forward, its limbs twisting unnaturally, pulling it across the floor faster than I could react. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam scattering wildly across the walls, catching glimpses of symbols pulsing red, of stone slick with black streaks that shouldn't have been there. The air was alive now, vibrating with that deafening pulse. Thump, 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 like the earth itself had a heartbeat. "Move." Elias' voice ripped through the roar, breaking me free. My legs finally obeyed, and I turned, grabbing Leah's arm as we bolted toward the tunnel. The thing shrieked behind us, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal, just wrong. It was high and sharp, a sound that seemed to stab into my brain and claw its way down my spine. I didn't dare look back. My mind refused to piece together what I'd seen. Its long, skeletal limbs, its faceless head tilting toward us like it could see even without eyes. The way it moved, pulling itself along the ground, its body flickering like it was struggling to hold its shape, was something no living thing should do. Leah stumbled as we ran, her boots skidding on the uneven stone. I grabbed her waist, yanking her upright, adrenaline turning my hands into steel. Ahead of us, Sarah and Elias were already in the tunnel, their flashlights bobbing erratically as they sprinted forward. I could hear it, that thing, scraping across the stone behind us. Its movements uneven but relentless, the whispering growing louder and louder, until it drowned out the blood pounding in my ears. We reached the tunnel's entrance, and for a split second, I thought we'd make it. I was wrong. The tunnel shifted. It was subtle at first, like the walls trembled in place. But then it wasn't. The carvings on the stone began to writhe and twist, pulling apart like veins tearing open. The ground buckled beneath my feet, the pulse growing stronger, matching the rhythm of my panicked heartbeat. I forced Leah into the tunnel, her flashlight spinning wildly as she stumbled forward. "Go! Keep moving!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. Behind me the shriek came again, closer now. I turned my head just enough to see it. The figure was pulling itself toward the tunnel, faster now, its limbs snapping as it crawled. My flashlight caught its face, or where a face should have been, just for a moment. There was nothing there, just darkness, endless and hollow, pulling me in like a black hole. My stomach dropped, my chest clenched. Then the tunnel collapsed behind us. Stone shattered, chunks of rock raining down, and I flung myself forward, landing hard against the ground. Dust filled the air, choking me as I crawled on hands and knees, my lungs burning. I turned my head just in time to see the entrance to the chamber seal itself shut, a deep, echoing boom vibrating through the earth. The pulse stopped. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of our gasping breaths and the soft clatter of loose rocks settling. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak, but enough to show me the others. Sarah had collapsed against the tunnel wall, coughing into her elbow. Leah sat on the ground, her back against the stone, her eyes wide, her face pale as a ghost. Elias was pacing, his flashlight bouncing off the narrow walls, his face pinched with terror. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice raw. No one answered. I didn't think any of us could. I sat up slowly, my ribs aching with every movement. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, narrow and unyielding, disappearing into the black. Behind us, there was nothing, just solid stone where the entrance to the chamber had been. It was like the earth had decided to close itself off, to trap us down here with whatever we had woken up. Leah broke the silence. It was watching us. Her voice trembled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked afraid. She wasn't wrong. I had felt it too. The weight of that thing's gaze, pulling at me, drawing me toward it like I was little more than a fly caught in a web. My skin prickled at the memory, my chest tightening, as though the air was still pressing down on me. "It's not just the sinkhole," Elias said. his voice low. "This isn't a natural formation. The symbols, this place, it's been here for centuries, maybe longer." Sarah shook her head, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Then what is it? What's down here?" No one wanted to say the truth aloud, that we didn't know, that there are things buried beneath the earth, forgotten by time, ignored by history, that should never have been found. The pulse was still in my chest, faint now, like an echo that refused to fade. It was alive, whatever it was, and it wanted us here. "We need to keep moving," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "There's no way back. If we stop here, we're done." Elias nodded, his expression grim. He started forward, his flashlight cutting through the black, the beam wobbling against the uneven walls. One by one, we followed. The tunnel stretched on forever, its ceiling so low in places that we had to crouch, its walls so narrow they pressed against our shoulders. The air grew colder as we moved, colder and wetter, until every breath felt like ice against my throat. I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen back there. How it moved, how it sounded. I could still hear it, even now. The scrape of its limbs, the hiss of its breath, the whisper of its voice curling through the dark. "Do you hear that?" Leah's whisper broke the silence. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. At first there was nothing, just the faint echo of our footsteps. But then I heard it, a faint sound drifting through the tunnel ahead. Drip, bite. Drip, bite. Drip, bite. It was water, or something that sounded like water. Elias moved faster, and we followed, the sound growing louder with each step. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a cavern, smaller than the first, but no less unsettling. The air was colder here, thick with mist that coiled around my ankles. At the center of the room, a pool of dark liquid reflected our flashlight beams like black glass. It wasn't water. The surface rippled as we approached, the sound of dripping echoing from somewhere deep within it. The carvings covered the cavern walls again, glowing faintly now, pulsing in time with the ripples spreading across the pool. "What is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Elias knelt by the edge, his face lit by the faint glow. "It's coming from here, the pulse, the sound, everything." He reached out as though to touch the surface, and a sharp panic seized me. "Don't!" I shouted. It was too late. The pool moved. The ripples exploded outward, and something rose from the center, dragging itself free of the liquid. It wasn't the figure from before. It was bigger, its shape shifting and flickering, limbs unraveling like smoke, its hollow face staring at us from across the cavern. The whispering returned, louder than ever, echoing through my skull until it was all I could hear. I grabbed Leah's arm, pulling her back as the thing moved closer, its form stretching, the pool churning around it. "We need to go," I shouted. Elias stumbled back, his face white as the pool began to boil. The ground shook, the whispers turning into a roar as the thing reached for us. And then we ran. The roar behind us was like an avalanche, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls and vibrated through my bones. We stumbled over uneven ground, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we ran, the beam of light barely cutting through the dense mist curling out of the pool. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the wet, slithering sound of something dragging itself free from that dark liquid. The whispering had returned, louder now, curling through the air like smoke, its voices layered and broken. The tunnel twisted ahead, shrinking so tight in places we had to duck low and scramble on all fours. The stone was damp and freezing under my palms, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and the thing that had risen. Elias was ahead of me, his breathing ragged, his flashlight beam swaying wildly. Behind me, Leah followed close, her hand clutching the back of my jacket so tightly it felt like her nails might tear through the fabric. Sarah brought up the rear, her light flickering as she stumbled and cursed, her voice shaking with panic. "We can't keep running." Sarah's voice cracked behind me, her words broken by gasps for breath. Where are we even going? I don't know. I yelled over my shoulder, the words bouncing off the walls, returning as faint whispers. I could hear the panic in my own voice, rising like bile. Just keep moving. The tunnel finally widened again, spilling us into another cavern. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my footing as the floor sloped downward. Elias was already there, his flashlight sweeping across the space, his eyes wide with disbelief. The cavern was massive, far larger than the last, its ceiling lost to the darkness above, but it wasn't empty. At the center, rising out of the stone like the roots of some ancient tree, stood a structure. A monolith carved from the same dark rock as the altar. It pulsed faintly in the light, the carvings on its surface glowing red, as though something beneath it was alive. The pattern spread outward across the cavern floor, etched deep into the stone, leading into dark tunnels on the far side. Leah's voice was barely a whisper. "What is that?" Elias stumbled forward, his flashlight trembling as he raised it toward the monolith. "It's ancient, older than anything we've ever seen." His voice was tight with awe and fear, his words trailing off as he stepped closer. This shouldn't exist." I couldn't take my eyes off it. The glow from the carving seemed to pulse in time with the thrum in the air, the same rhythmic beat we'd heard since we fell into this place. It was stronger now, vibrating through my chest, through my skull, drowning out my thoughts. My flashlight wavered as I scanned the base of the monolith, and that's when I saw them. Figures. Not alive, not moving, statues, dozens of them, hunched and twisted as though they'd been frozen mid-scream. Their bodies were human, but wrong. Limbs elongated, faces stretched into grotesque expressions of terror. Their eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow, deep pits carved into their skulls. Some were clutching their heads, their hands frozen over their ears, while others were reaching toward the monolith, as though drawn to it before they were turned to stone. "Don't touch it!" I shouted at Elias as he approached. My voice echoed back at me, too loud, too sharp. Elias froze mid-step, turning to look at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "It's calling to us," he said softly, almost dreamlike. "Don't you feel it? It's like it's alive. It doesn't want us here." Leah snapped, her voice breaking. "Elias, we need to leave. Now." But he wasn't listening. He took another step toward the monolith, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was fighting against an invisible force. The pulse in the air quickened. The whispers grew louder, threading through my mind, overlapping into a discordant chant that made my vision blur. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, my hands pressed against the stone as I tried to drown them out. Leah screamed, her voice sharp and panicked. "Elias!" I looked up, just in time to see it. The monolith flared brighter, its glow spilling outward in waves. The air around it rippled like heat rising off asphalt, distorting everything it touched. Elias froze mid-step, his face lit by the red glow, his eyes wide with something between terror and awe. The whispers turned into a roar, vibrating through the cavern, shaking the walls. The statues moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift in the shadows, but then they twitched. Their hollow eyes turned toward Elias, their limbs creaking, as they began to pull themselves free from the stone. I couldn't move. I could only watch as they unfolded, their bodies twisting unnaturally, their mouths stretching open in silent screams. Elias turned to run, but it was too late. One of them reached him, its arm snapping outward like a whip, its fingers wrapping around his shoulder. He screamed, a sound I'll never forget, as the statue's grip tightened, pulling him toward the monolith. The glow flared brighter, and for a split second, Elias' face twisted in agony before he went still. The light swallowed him, and then he was gone. The statues turned toward us, their hollow faces blank, their bodies jerking as they moved. Leah grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "Daniel, run!" We bolted for the nearest tunnel, Sarah's flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, Stone feet scraping against stone, the whispering growing louder, following us through the dark. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing again, pressing in close. My lungs burned, my muscles screaming with every step, but we didn't stop. Keep going. I choked out, my voice breaking. Don't stop. The ground trembled beneath us, the pulse still there, still stronger, matching the frantic pounding of my heart. The whispering turned into something else now. Laughter, faint and broken, drifting through the air like smoke, curling around me as we ran. We burst into another chamber, smaller this time, and collapsed against the far wall. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my flashlight shaking as I swept it across the room. There were no statues here, no carvings, just bare stone and silence. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her face buried in her hand. Leah sat beside me, her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly as she whispered under her breath, "Where's Elias?" Sarah's voice was muffled, broken. I didn't answer, because I knew the truth. Elias was gone, swallowed by whatever lived inside the monolith, just like those statues. Those things had been before him. The pulse still throbbed in the air, faint now, but ever present, like it was waiting, watching, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had all of us. The silence in the chamber pressed against me like a weight, heavy and suffocating. I could still hear the faint echo of Elias's scream in my head, replaying over and over until it felt like it was stitched into my thought. The monolith's red glow had seared itself behind my eyes. Every time I blinked, I saw it pulsing in the dark, like some twisted beacon. Sarah's sobs were faint, muffled by her hands as she knelt on the floor, her body trembling with every breath. Leah sat next to me, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them, as though she could hold herself together through sheer force. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering something I couldn't hear. A prayer, maybe. Or maybe just pleading for this nightmare to end. I leaned my head back against the cold stone wall, forcing myself to breathe through the knot in my chest. My flashlight sat beside me, its beam flickering, the battery starting to give out. The tunnel we had run through now stretched behind us like a throat, dark and unrelenting, and we had nowhere else to go. Elias was gone. I'd seen it. I'd seen the way the statues, those things, dragged him toward the monolith like he was nothing more than a puppet, his scream ringing through the air as he vanished into the light. I didn't know what had happened to him. I didn't want to know. But the way the monolith pulsed after, like it was satisfied, left a sick feeling twisting in my gut. Leah's voice broke through the silence, so soft I almost didn't hear her. "We shouldn't have come here." I turned my head toward her. Her eyes were distant, staring at the floor like she wasn't really seeing it. "They wanted us here," she continued, her voice hollow, almost mechanical. "Whatever's down here, it called us. All of us. Elias didn't fall. He didn't trip. He walked toward it, Daniel. He walked. It was in his head." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. "It's not going to get us," I said, though my voice sounded weak, even to me. Leah laughed softly, a sound that had no humor in it. "You don't understand, do you? It doesn't need to get us. It's already here." Sarah lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale in the dim light. "Stop it, Leah," she choked out, her voice raw. "We can still get out. We just need to find a way. There's got to be another way up." But Leah shook her head, still staring at the floor. "There is no way up. This place doesn't let people leave. You saw it, you felt it." Her words settled over us like a fog, thick and impossible to escape. She was right, of course. I had felt it. The pull, the hum in the air. The way the monolith seemed to crawl into my mind the closer I got to it. But I couldn't let myself believe we were trapped here. I couldn't. I picked up my flashlight and stood, the light shaking slightly in my grip. Then we find a way out anyway. We don't just sit here and wait for whatever's down here to take us. That's what it wants. Sarah wiped at her face with the sleeve of her jacket and pushed herself upright. Her hands were shaking, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. "He's right. Sitting here won't help. We move." Leah didn't argue. She just stood silently, her movements slow and mechanical, like she was moving on autopilot. I turned the flashlight toward the far end of the chamber, where the tunnel stretched into the unknown, and started walking. Every step echoed off the stone walls, the sound bouncing back at me like something following close behind. The whispering returned, not loud, not distinct, but there, threading through the silence, like faint cracks in glass. Sarah walked just behind me, her flashlight flickering as she swept it back and forth. Leah trailed behind, her steps soft and uneven, as though the effort of moving was too much. None of us spoke. The air was cold here, colder than before, and I could see my breath curling in thin clouds in front of me. The further we walked, the more it felt like the tunnel itself was pressing in on us, closing tighter, swallowing us, inch by inch. After what felt like hours, we reached an opening. I froze as I stepped into the cavern beyond, my flashlight beam sweeping over the space. It was massive, easily larger than the last, with towering columns of stone rising out of the ground like broken teeth. The carvings were everywhere now, glowing faintly, lighting the space with an eerie red glow that pulsed in time with the deep, rhythmic hum that filled the air. The sound was louder here, so much louder, vibrating through my chest, my teeth, the tips of my fingers. At the center of the cavern, there was a pit, a vast, yawning hole in the earth that stretched downward into darkness. The carvings led straight to it, veins of glowing light converging at its edges, as though feeding into it, or perhaps feeding from it. The hum seemed to come from the pit, deep and resonant, vibrating the very ground beneath our feet. "We're not going in there," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Leah stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hands as she peered into the darkness below. "It's awake," she murmured. "What's awake?" I demanded, my voice sharp, my patience finally breaking. She turned toward me, her face pale and drawn, her eyes too wide. "The thing that was buried here. The thing they worship." I didn't want to ask who they were. I didn't want to know. But as I scanned the cavern, I saw them, shapes scattered along the edges of the pit. Statues like before, dozens of them, hunched and twisted, their faces frozen in agony, their hollow eyes staring down into the abyss. Sarah let out a strangled sound and stumbled back. "We have to go. Now." I turned toward the tunnel, but the ground shifted beneath us. The carvings flared brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the hum grew deafening. The statues moved. It started as a twitch, a flicker of motion, but then their limbs began to jerk and snap, pulling them upright. Their heads turned toward us in unison, those hollow sockets locking onto me like a predator locking onto prey. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering turned into a roar, and the pit screamed. The sound tore through the cavern, rattling my skull, driving me to my knees. I grabbed at my ears, but it didn't stop. It wasn't a sound you could block out. It was inside me, vibrating through my bones, pulling me toward the pit, toward the darkness. Leah dropped her flashlight and staggered forward, her face blank, her steps slow and deliberate, like she wasn't in control of her own body. "Leah!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet. She didn't stop. She didn't turn. The statues were closing in now, their movements twitchy and jerky, surrounding us, cutting us off from the tunnel. I grabbed Leah's arm, yanking her back with every ounce of strength I had. Her body shuddered, and for a split second, her eyes met mine, clear, terrified. "Run!" she whispered. And then the ground gave way. The ground cracked and dropped beneath us like a trapdoor swinging open, pulling us into the dark. My stomach lurched, the weightless feeling twisting into pure panic as I tumbled through air and stone. The roar of collapsing rock was deafening, a wall of sound that swallowed my scream before it could escape my throat. I reached out blindly, my fingers scraping against the rough edges of stone. But there was nothing to grab, only empty space and the pull of gravity. When I hit the ground, the impact sent a shockwave through my body. Pain exploded through my side as my ribs collided with hard rock, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I lay there, stunned, my ears ringing, my mind struggling to make sense of anything. The world felt like it had caved in around me, because it had. Danielle, Sarah's voice, distant but urgent, broke through the ringing in my ears. It pulled me back, like a rope dragging me from drowning waters. I coughed, my lungs aching, and pushed myself upright. My hands were shaking. My flashlight cracked and dim, but it still worked. The beam flickered weakly, cutting through the black. I wasn't alone. Sarah's light blinked into view across the chamber. She was on her knees, clutching her arm, blood streaking down the side of her face. Leah was next to her, slumped but conscious, blinking slowly like she was trying to remember where she was. Around us, chunks of stone littered the floor, dust hanging in the air like fog. "We're alive," I croaked, my voice hoarse, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The chamber was smaller than the others, the ceiling jagged where we'd fallen through. The walls pressed closer, covered with those same markings, deeper now, etched as though the stone had been burned. They glowed faintly, pulsating like veins beneath skin, their red light casting shadows that seemed to move even when we didn't. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the stone beneath us, rattling my teeth. But the worst part wasn't the light or the hum. It was the pit. The center of the chamber sank into a hole, a massive gash torn into the ground. The edges were uneven, crumbling, as though something had clawed its way up from below. The darkness within it was absolute, impenetrable, even by the beam of my flashlight. I couldn't see the bottom, but I could feel it. The emptiness. The cold weight of it pressing against my chest, drawing me toward it like gravity had shifted. Sarah staggered to her feet, swaying slightly as she pointed toward it. It's where it came from, isn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We all knew. Leah groaned softly as she sat up, her eyes darting to the pit, widening with recognition. "It's awake," she whispered. "The thing we saw before. That was just a part of it. A piece. The rest is down there." Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold air. I turned to her, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can't think about that right now. We need to find a way out. That's all that matters." But as the words left my mouth, the whispering began again. It came from the pit, soft at first, like a breeze moving across dead leaves, then louder, sharper, voices overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my head ache. The words were still unintelligible, but the sound of them crawled through me like icy fingers, pressing against my mind, pulling me closer to the edge. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she staggered back, clutching her head. "Do you hear it? Do you hear it? Stay away from the edge," I shouted, reaching for her, but she stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the ground. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back as her shoes scraped against the loose gravel. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, her mouth moving silently, as though she were repeating the whispers to herself. Leah stood, swaying, her gaze locked on the pit. "It's calling to us," she said faintly. I whipped around to face her. "Don't listen to it. It's not real. Whatever this is, whatever's down there, it's trying to pull us in. We have to fight it." The words sounded weak, even to me. I could feel it too, the pull of that endless dark. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts clouded, like the whispers were slipping under my skin and wrapping around my bones. And then the ground shook. The vibration started as a low rumble, building until the entire chamber trembled. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling, and the hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull. The light from the markings flared brighter, casting blood-red shadows that danced across the walls. From the pit came a sound, deep and resonant, like a groan from something ancient. It rose slowly, rumbling up through the stone, growing louder until it felt like the earth itself was screaming. I grabbed Leah's arm, yanking her back as cracks splintered across the ground, spiderwebbing outward from the pit's edge. "We need to move," I shouted, but my voice was lost in the roar. The pit shifted. Something moved within it, something massive and slow, its form hidden in the darkness, but its presence undeniable. The air turned frigid as the whispering merged into a single low chant, rhythmic and hollow, vibrating through the ground. The walls. Us. Leah screamed as her flashlight blinked out, leaving us with nothing but the red glow of the markings. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward Sarah as the ground beneath us cracked and buckled. The pit was spreading, growing wider with every second, and from its depths came the unmistakable sound of breathing. Slow, deep, and endless. The chamber began to collapse. Chunks of stone crashed down around us, shattering into clouds of dust. I ran, dragging Leah with me, Sarah close behind. The air was thick, heavy, filled with the pulse that matched every beat of my heart. Ahead, a tunnel, narrow, jagged, but real, opened up at the far end of the chamber. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to breathe. I just ran, the others at my heels as the pit yawned wider, its edges crumbling into the dark. The roar chased us, the sound of the earth splitting apart, and with it came a feeling, a certainty, that something enormous was rising behind us. We stumbled into the tunnel just as the ground gave way, the edges collapsing into the void. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The air was thick with dust and heat, the whispering still lingering in my ears, like it was inside me now. The tunnel stretched ahead, but the hum, the pulse, followed us. It was part of the earth, part of everything. And as I ran, my lungs burning, my heart pounding, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This place didn't want us to escape, and it wasn't going to let us. The tunnel stretched on forever, narrowing as we ran, its walls clawing at us like jagged fingers. The ground beneath my boots shook with every step, the hum rising to an unbearable pitch, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the thick dust clouding the air. I didn't dare look back. I knew what was behind us. I could feel it, looming, relentless, just beyond the light. Sarah's breathing was ragged behind me, each gasp sharp and desperate. Leah stumbled more than once, but I kept pulling her forward, her hand a vice around my wrist, slick with sweat. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, layered, broken voices crowding my head, their words still indistinct but heavy with meaning. They filled every inch of me, burrowing under my skin, sinking into my thoughts until I couldn't tell where my mind ended, and theirs began. The tunnel dipped downward, and the ground grew slick with something I refused to look at. My flashlight wavered across the walls, catching glimpses of carvings that pulsed with the same sick red glow. The symbols were shifting now, writhing, alive in a way that made my stomach turn. I forced myself not to stop, not to think, because stopping meant dying, or worse. Ahead of us, the tunnel opened into another chamber, its ceiling lost to darkness. I skidded to a halt just inside, dragging Leah and Sarah with me. The space was massive, the air thick and heavy, as if we'd stepped into the chest of something alive. At the far end of the chamber, it waited. A monolith. Not like the first, but something far worse, rose from the center of the cavern. It wasn't stone anymore. It moved, its surface rippling like liquid, veins of red light pulsing just beneath its skin. The markings weren't carved. They were burned into it, glowing brighter with every pulse of the hum that now rattled through the air. The stone, me. And there, at the base of the monolith, the earth opened. A chasm stretched deep into the rock, so wide it seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. Shadows moved within it, shapes that slithered and twitched just out of sight. The sound rising from it was worse than the whispers now. A slow, deep breathing, as though the chasm itself was alive. Each inhale pulled the air from the room, leaving us gasping for breath. Each exhale rattled through my bones, heavy and ancient, as though it carried the weight of something older than time. Leah's voice broke, trembling, as she whispered, "It's waking up." I turned toward her, my flashlight catching the wild terror in her eyes. "What's waking up?" I asked, though I already knew. Her answer came barely above a whisper. "Everything." The hum reached its peak then, No longer just sound but pressure, pressing against my skull like hands trying to crack it open. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head and screaming, her flashlight spinning wildly across the ground before flickering out. I stumbled back, grabbing Leah, trying to drag her away from the edge of the chasm, as the shadows moved faster now, spreading outward like oil through water. The monolith shifted, rising taller, its form rippling as though something massive was forcing its way through. The red glow flared so bright it burned behind my eyelids, but I couldn't look away. It was alive. It was pulling itself up from the chasm, something vast and shapeless, its form twisting and stretching as it clawed its way free. I couldn't see it fully, couldn't comprehend it, but I felt it. Its presence crashed over me like a tidal wave, freezing my blood, crushing the air from my lungs. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, my flashlight clattering from my grip. The whispers turned into a single voice, low and resonant, vibrating through the cavern. The words still didn't make sense, but I understood them. They weren't asking. They weren't warning. They were claiming. This place wasn't a grave. It was a door, and we had opened it. Daniel. Leah's scream ripped through the noise, sharp and desperate. I turned to see her pulling Sarah to her feet, her flashlight swinging wildly as the shadows around us began to move. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Figures like the ones we'd seen before, statues that weren't statues, their limbs jerking as they pulled themselves free of the stone. Their hollow faces turned toward us in unison, their mouths stretching open in silent, endless screams. I grabbed Leah's arm and ran, pulling her toward the far side of the chamber. I didn't know where we were going. There was no way out, no light, no escape, but I couldn't stop. The ground shook beneath us, cracks spiderwebbing across the stone. The monolith roaring like the earth itself was being torn apart. The chasm widened, its edge crumbling as the thing beneath it rose higher, its shape bending and twisting, pulling at the very fabric of the air around us. Leah stumbled, and I turned just in time to catch her before she fell. "Get up," I shouted, my voice ragged. "We can't stop." Sarah was ahead of us now, running toward a faint glow at the far end of the chamber, a fissure in the wall, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. It wasn't an exit, but it was something. I forced my legs to move faster, dragging Leah with me, the sound of stone splitting and shadows crawling closer with every step. Behind us, the monolith shattered. The sound was a shriek, metal on metal, glass on glass, so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. A shockwave blasted through the chamber, and I was thrown forward, my body colliding hard with the ground. Pain lanced through my shoulder, but I forced myself up, grabbing Leah and shoving her toward the fissure. "Go!" I screamed. She hesitated for only a moment before disappearing through the crack, followed by Sarah. I turned back just once, my flashlight beam catching the chaos behind me. The cavern collapsing, the chasm spreading, the shadows pouring upward as the thing rose, its form unfathomable, its presence heavy enough to crush the world. I didn't look again. I turned and ran, throwing myself into the fissure, dragging my body through jagged stone that tore at my clothes and skin. The roar of the collapsing chamber followed me, dust and debris choking the air as I pushed forward, my lungs screaming for breath. Then, suddenly, there was light. I burst out onto solid ground, collapsing in a heap as cold air hit my face like a slap. The world outside was pale and gray, the sky overcast, the desert stretching out endlessly before me. Leah and Sarah were there too, sprawled a few feet away, gasping for breath. I sat up slowly, my body shaking, and turned to look behind us. The fissure in the earth was closing, the ground swallowing itself like a wound knit and shut. The hum was fading now, distant, but still there, like a whisper on the wind. I could still feel it. The thing we'd seen, the thing we'd woken, waiting just below the surface. Sarah stared at me, her face streaked with blood and dust. "Is it over?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure it would ever be over. I looked out across the empty desert, the wind tugging at my torn clothes, the silence pressing down like a weight. In the distance, I thought I heard it, the faintest echo of that hum, drifting through the air like a memory. We had escaped, but I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't done with us. It was awake now, and it was waiting.